Hello fellow sapiens, welcome to Sleepless Homo. This episode is special. It's dedicated to a deeply touching comment left under my Yellowstone video, and I feel privileged to honour that request. Now quiet your mind, and let this slow storytelling keep you company, whether you're settling into sleep, working, showering, or driving with headphones on. If you appreciate this kind of calm, fact-based science, I'd be grateful if you like and subscribe. It helps long-form educational content reach others who need a softer way to learn, and maybe even conquer the world with knowledge instead of noise. I'd also love to hear in the comments how you use these videos. Do you drift off with them at night, or play them while doing tasks? And if you do fall asleep partway, don't worry. I've left timestamps in the description so you can pick up where you left off. This is a channel for soft science, not wild speculation, just a humble attempt to share what we know so far. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. What if the path to becoming human was never about one single type of mind, but a spectrum of ways to think, notice, and respond to the world? When we look deep into the story of our genus, back to the shifting landscapes of Africa nearly 3 million years ago, the fossil record does not show us consciousness or personality, but bones and tools. Yet behind those fragments were individuals, and like us today, they would not all have been identical. Variation is as fundamental to life as reproduction itself. Every band of early hominins would have carried within it the seeds of difference. Some quick to act, some cautious, some relentless in problem solving, some content to follow, some drawn to novelty, some anchored in routine. This was not noise in the system, it was the system, it was how survival worked. In the early Pleistocene, between about 3 million and 2 million years ago, Africa's climate was changing. The Great Rift Valley was a stage of transformation, with forests shrinking, lakes filling and drying, and grasslands expanding. Within this landscape moved Australopiths, upright apes with brains larger than chimpanzees, but still far from modern human proportions. They used stone flakes and simple pounding tools. They exploited plants, scavenged meat, and adapted to shifting habitats. Within these groups, survival depended not only on the sharp edge of a stone, but also on how individuals noticed danger, how they solved the puzzle of a hidden route, or how they dared to cross into new terrain. Here is where variation mattered. We can see this reflected in modern primates, who are our closest living window into what those communities might have felt like. Chimpanzees, for instance, show marked differences in personality. Some are explorers, handling unfamiliar objects with curiosity, while others hang back, avoiding risk. Among baboons, some are more aggressive and confrontational, others patient and calculating. Even in capuchin monkeys, scientists observe individuals who innovate with tools while their peers simply copy or ignore. These are not malfunctions of the species, they are strategies, each useful in different circumstances. In stable times, the cautious may thrive. In moments of upheaval, the daring often lead the way. And in social animals, balance between these tendencies ensures resilience. It is reasonable to imagine that our early ancestors were no different. A band of Australopiths, or early Homo habilis, was not a hive of uniformity, but a patchwork of temperaments. Some individuals might have been especially attentive to patterns, the sound of a bird alarm, the trace of a predator in the grass. Others might have been socially inventive, able to smooth tensions or take unusual approaches to sharing food. A few might have been restless, ranging farther than the rest, stumbling into landscapes where future opportunities waited. Variation of attention, of energy, of patience, of curiosity, all of these would have woven together the survival fabric of a group. From the perspective of evolution, natural selection acts not on individuals alone, but on populations. If a drought struck, perhaps those inclined to experiment with new food sources would be the difference between survival and starvation. If predators pressed, the ones who could maintain calm might steady the group's reactions. This is the heart of variation. It is not about defect, it is about breadth. No single strategy can anticipate every challenge in a volatile environment like the Rift Valley, where rainfall could swing wildly and where habitats shifted within a few generations. Populations with wider behavioural repertoires stood a better chance. This framing helps us reimagine the story of mind. Too often we think in linear terms, that intelligence grew as brains got bigger, that one hominin replaced another in a march toward improvement. But life in the deep past was not a straight ladder. It was a branching tree, and within each branch were groups of individuals who thought and acted differently. Just as diversity of bodies can make a herd more resilient, tall individuals scanning for danger, smaller ones slipping through dense brush, diversity of minds may have stabilized early human communities against the unpredictability of their world. The archaeological record itself hints at this. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒, sites dated to nearly 2 million years ago show scatters of stone tools alongside butchered bones. But not every tool was made with the same skill. Some are crude flakes, others finely struck. Some sites show signs of repeated visits, almost habitual places. Others appear as brief improvisations. These differences suggest not just chance but variety in the way individuals approach problems. To us they look like uneven craftsmanship. To the people of the time they may have represented different roles. Some skilled artisans, some adequate imitators, some relying more on social bonds than on technical ability. We do not know the inner lives of these beings. We cannot project modern labels backward with certainty. But from an evolutionary standpoint, it is implausible that they were uniform. Every species studied today reveals a spectrum of cognitive tendencies. Even in insects, some are more exploratory than others. In wolves, personalities range from bold leaders to cautious followers. In elephants, some excel at memory, others at forging new paths. These patterns repeat because variation is not an accident of biology. It is a strategy. It is how species buffer themselves against the unknown. So when we ask whether all minds were alike in the deep prehistory of our genus, the answer is almost certainly no. And perhaps that difference, invisible in the bones, was as important to survival as any stone tool. In the shifting ecosystems of Africa between 3 million and 2 million years ago, diversity of mind may have been the quiet, unrecorded foundation that allowed our ancestors to adapt. If that is true, then what we call neurodiversity today is not a modern anomaly. It may be the ancient condition of our species and even our lineage before we were fully human. It was not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be carried. And the story of becoming human is as much about those subtle, varied ways of being as it is about the visible fossils we unearth. The haunting thought is that we may never truly see those minds, only infer them. Yet perhaps their differences, unnoticed in prehistory, are still with us, shaping who we are and reminding us that sameness was never the rule of survival. To picture this more clearly, imagine a small band of early hominins gathered at the edge of a Rift Valley lake 2.5 million years ago. The sun is low, the air sharp with the scent of drying grasses. One individual edges away from the group to investigate a pile of reeds where frogs leap. Another lingers, carefully inspecting a rock before striking it to reveal a flake. A third is restless, pacing along the shoreline, eyes on the horizon. None of these approaches is inherently better or worse. Together they represent different strategies of noticing, testing, and moving through the world. What we often forget is that survival is not only about who can make the sharpest tool or run the fastest. It is also about who can see opportunities where others see nothing, who dares to poke at a wasp nest or taste a bitter root, who refuses to follow the group and instead walks in the opposite direction. These behaviours might seem inefficient or even reckless at first glance. Yet, across evolutionary time, they introduce flexibility. The cautious and the bold, the detail-focused and the big-picture wanderers, all of them can, in different contexts, open doors to survival that would otherwise stay shut. Evidence from the fossil record also hints at this spectrum. Dental microwear studies, for example, show that some Australopiths had heavily worn teeth consistent with grinding tough grasses, while others in the same species seem to have eaten more varied diets. This suggests not just environmental influence but individual differences in food choice. Similarly, isotopic analyses reveal diversity in resource use even among groups living in similar landscapes. Some individuals drew more heavily on woodland plants, others on open savanna resources. Such patterns point to different foraging decisions shaped by preference, habit, or inclination. Modern primatology adds another layer. In groups of chimpanzees, certain individuals consistently act as innovators, discovering new tool techniques like termite fishing or nut cracking. Others rarely invent but are quick to imitate, spreading innovations through the group. and still others are resistant, clinging to older ways. Without the experimenters, progress would stall. Without the imitators, it would never spread. Without the conservatives, there would be stability when new methods failed. It is the coexistence of these tendencies that makes the group robust. Early hominins likely lived under similar dynamics, where variation in behaviour was the invisible scaffolding holding communities together. It is humbling to realise how much of this record is beyond our grasp. Fossils preserve bones but not temperaments. Archaeological sites show us tools but not the hands that hesitated or the minds that insisted on trying something odd. Yet by piecing together ecological clues and comparing with living relatives, we can glimpse the outlines of those lost personalities. The Rift Valley may have looked like a harsh test of endurance, but it was also a laboratory of difference, a place where no single way of thinking could guarantee success, and so many ways had to coexist. If that was true, then the story of humanity begins not with uniformity, but with a patchwork of minds. The legacy of that variation may be the very reason we are still here to ask the question. Why do some individuals break the pattern while others conform? It is a question that echoes across deep time, and when we turn to the early Pleistocene around 2 million years ago, we begin to see its weight in the archaeological and ecological record. This was an age when early hominins such as Homo erectus began to step into landscapes larger, harsher, and more unpredictable than any their ancestors had faced. The climate was shifting, savannas were stretching wider, and herds of herbivores moved in seasonal cycles that demanded strategy rather than habit. In such conditions, no single behavioural template could guarantee survival. What kept small groups afloat was a strange balance of opposites: the oddballs who did not follow the expected path, and the conformists who provided reliability. In modern primates, we still see this balance at work. Some chimpanzees display unusually high exploratory tendencies, testing tools, inspecting novel foods, even daring to poke at venomous animals. Others remain consistent in their patterns, rarely straying beyond what is proven. Each carries costs. The explorer may die from a bad decision, poisoning themselves or angering a predator. The conservative may miss opportunities or lag behind when conditions change. But across the group, the combination becomes an adaptive toolkit. The oddball uncovers new possibilities. The conformist sustains the old baseline. Early hominins must have lived in this same rhythm of risk and security. Archaeology hints at such differences. At sites in East Africa, we find stone flakes that vary widely in precision. Some individuals struck cores with striking regularity, producing useful cutting edges again and again. Others seem to have been more experimental, leaving behind pieces that look less standardized, as if they were trying techniques that did not catch on. It is tempting to interpret this as skill or lack thereof, but it could also represent variation in approach, the one who refines, the one who tests. Both strategies matter. In a dangerous landscape, a group needed both the steady hands that produced reliable tools and the restless minds willing to stumble across innovations by accident. The ecological setting of 2 million years ago amplified the importance of such variation. Grasslands were home to grazing herds, but woodlands and riverbanks still offered fallback foods like roots and tubers. Some individuals may have leaned heavily on persistence hunting, tracking prey until exhaustion gave them meat. Others may have been better at digging for plants or cracking open nuts. This spread of behaviour meant that when prey fled, or a drought parched the savannah, some members of the group could still bring calories home. In small bands where survival could hinge on a single meal, diversity of strategies was not a luxury. It was a form of insurance. Interestingly, ecological studies of non-human animals also show that such variation is not random noise. Populations of fish, for example, often contain both bold individuals that explore new territories and shy ones that stick to safe zones. The balance keeps the group resilient when environments shift. Similarly, in birds, some are innovators while others are imitators, and both roles stabilize group culture. Evolution does not erase difference but seems to preserve it, because variety itself is adaptive. If that is true for guppies and crows, it is hard not to imagine it was equally true for early humans walking the Rift Valley plains. We should be careful not to overstate our certainty. Fossils cannot tell us who in a group was bold and who was cautious, but patterns of survival, migration, and tool use suggests that not every mind was aligned. If all early hominins had thought and acted in exactly the same way, the odds of navigating 2 million years of shifting climate and terrain would have been vanishingly small. It is more likely that difference was built in from the beginning. Some broke the pattern, others held the line, and together they created the strange adaptability that would eventually characterize our lineage. In a sense, the oddballs were not accidents. They were essential, and if we follow that thread forward, we begin to see that variation in minds and behaviours was not a late addition to the human story, but one of its earliest foundations. It suggests that humanity's survival was never about uniformity, but about making room for difference. If we look more closely at early hominin life around 2 million years ago, what emerges is a portrait of small groups constantly walking a tightrope between the predictable and the surprising. Daily existence required routines, returning to familiar waterholes, following herds along known paths, using stones in ways that had worked for generations. But life also demanded occasional leaps into the unknown. A waterhole could dry up, a herd might migrate elsewhere, a plant once safe could turn bitter. In those moments, it was often the individual who broke the mould, who decided to dig a little deeper, to wander a little farther, to taste something odd, who uncovered the resource that tipped survival back into balance. One of the most vivid ways to explore this idea is through primate behaviour observed today. In groups of vervet monkeys, for example, some individuals are consistently more willing to approach novel foods or human objects. Researchers have found that these bolder monkeys often discover new food sources first, but they also face greater risks, sometimes eating dangerous substances. The group benefits from the discoveries without every individual having to take the same risks. Transpose this to early hominin life, and you can see how one unusually adventurous individual might stumble on a hidden tuber patch, or a novel way to crack a bone, giving the group a small but crucial advantage. Ecology too reinforces this point. In environments that swing between extremes, wet and dry seasons, boom and bust cycles of prey, behavioural flexibility matters. Populations that contain both specialists and generalists tend to persist longer than those composed only of one type. Specialists maximise returns when conditions are stable. Generalists keep the population alive when things change. Early hominins likely embodied this mix not across species but within small groups, with individuals leaning toward different ends of the spectrum. One might have been a specialist in tracking gazelle trails, another more adept at gathering fallback foods, another constantly scanning for novel opportunities. Even stone tools reflect these dynamics. The earliest Alderaan flakes, often associated with Homo habilis, show wide variability in form. Some appear expertly knapped with sharp edges, others are cruder, barely functional. Archaeologists debate whether this reflects skill differences, situational needs, or even personality. What matters is that within the archaeological layers we see not uniformity but a spread of behaviours, some individuals repeating reliable methods, others perhaps experimenting, trying to push the material in new ways. This blend mirrors the Adaptive Oddballs model, stability paired with innovation. Predators must also be considered in this equation. Savannah life meant facing leopards, hyenas, and lions, each requiring vigilance and strategy. Some hominins may have excelled at watchfulness, catching subtle cues that others overlooked. Others may have been inclined to distraction, scanning widely instead of focusing intently. Both tendencies could serve a group. The sharp-eyed sentinel might detect an ambush in time. The distractible wanderer might notice a distant carcass worth scavenging. Different attentional styles preserved in balance likely increased the odds of group survival. Another lens comes from anthropology. Hunter-gatherer groups studied in more recent times show that division of labour is not only based on sex or age, but often on personality. Some individuals are known for their endurance, others for their storytelling, others for their patience in foraging. These roles create a mosaic of contributions that no single individual could fulfill. Extrapolate backwards to early hominin societies, and it seems likely that what we now call personality variation was already carving out niches that stabilised the band. It is worth pausing here to recognise the humility this requires of us. We cannot look at a fossil and declare with certainty that one individual was bold and another cautious, but we can see that variability was preserved across time. Natural selection tends to prune away traits that consistently lower survival. the fact that variation persisted suggests it carried benefits, even if they were indirect or intermittent. Oddballs survived not because they always succeeded, but because their differences occasionally produced payoffs big enough to sustain the group. This should make us reconsider how we frame difference. Too often, in modern times, we view deviation from the average as something to fix or explain away. But the evolutionary record suggests the opposite, that deviation was always part of the system, not a flaw in it. Early hominin bands survived precisely because not everyone thought or acted the same. Conformity built cohesion, but oddness built resilience. Without both, the experiment of humanity might never have reached beyond Africa's ancient valleys. Seen this way, the adaptive oddballs of the deep past are not curiosities. They are a reminder that variation is itself an evolutionary strategy, one written into our lineage from its earliest days. We are not the product of uniform minds marching in step, but of a long experiment in diversity, where difference was not weakness, but a quiet form of strength. Around 1,900,000 years ago, something remarkable began to happen. Our genus, Homo, specifically Homo erectus, stepped beyond the cradle of Africa and began to test its luck in new environments. Fossil sites in Georgia, Java, and China show that these early humans spread far and wide, encountering landscapes that could not have been more different from the East African Rift, where their ancestors first emerged. Dry steppes, humid forests, volcanic highlands, river valleys, each presented its own set of dangers and opportunities. To meet these challenges, it was not enough to simply carry stone tools and a strong body. What mattered just as much was the spectrum of minds within a group, each suited to different roles. Consider endurance hunting, one of the defining strategies attributed to Homo erectus. Unlike ambush predators such as lions, these hominins are thought to have pursued prey across long distances, using sweat glands, upright posture, and sheer stamina to outlast animals until they collapsed from exhaustion. But persistence hunting is not simply about lungs and legs. It demands acute observational skills, reading tracks, noticing subtle shifts in vegetation, judging when a herd has begun to tire. Within a group, not everyone would excel at this. Some may have been natural trackers, hyper-focused on the trail, unwilling to let a faint footprint fade into the dust. Others may have been less suited to the chase but vital in a different role, tending to the young during long pursuits, or scavenging plants and small animals to buffer the group's diet. The presence of fire, though still debated for this early period, adds another layer. Even before consistent mastery, wildfires would have created both hazards and opportunities. Those who dared to approach smouldering embers could find roasted tubers or animals left behind. Others, more cautious, might have been invaluable in guiding the group to safety or maintaining distance until the flames died down. Later, when controlled use of fire became more likely, the role of firekeepers would emerge. Individuals tasked with guarding embers, feeding fuel, and ensuring that a precious flame survived the night or the rainstorm. Such tasks required patience, vigilance, and perhaps even a tendency toward obsessiveness, traits not evenly distributed across a population. A band where someone naturally fixated on maintaining the fire would fare better than one where all members were easily distracted. Foraging itself revealed the value of cognitive diversity. Some individuals in a group might specialize in scanning widely, covering broad areas to locate new resources. Others might specialize in careful inspection, remembering precisely where a certain plant grew or which tree hosted edible insects. Archaeological studies of stone tool scatters show that groups often return to the same sites repeatedly, suggesting some individuals were adept at navigation and spatial memory, guiding their companions back to reliable resource zones. These different tendencies together created resilience. The explorers opened new options, the memorizers anchored stability, and the detail-focused prevented dangerous mistakes. When Homo erectus moved into Asia, they encountered prey species and plants unlike those of Africa. Here, niche roles became even more important. A group entering temperate woodlands could not rely solely on strategies suited to open savanna. Success required flexibility, individuals willing to test unknown foods, others cautious enough to notice signs of toxicity, and still others persistent enough to refine new methods of tool use. In a sense, cognitive variety acted like a genetic insurance policy, increasing the odds that at least one approach would succeed in an unfamiliar land. The fossil record hints at this adaptability. In Dmanisi, Georgia, we find some of the earliest remains of Homo erectus outside Africa, dating to around 1,800,000 years ago. What is striking is the variation within that small sample. Some skulls are larger, some smaller, some more robust, some more gracile. Scientists still debate whether these differences represent sexual dimorphism, age variation, or even separate species. But one possibility is that such diversity reflects a population where differences were not filtered out but preserved. If the bones varied, why not also the behaviours? The expansion of Homo erectus across continents may itself testify to the survival value of such diversity. And here we meet a fascinating paradox. A band too uniform in its cognitive style would have been brittle, vulnerable to collapse when the environment shifted. But a band too diverse without cohesion might have fractured under tension. The trick, one suspects, lay in the balance, having enough difference to adapt, but enough common ground to stay together. That is not something we can measure in a fossil or a flake of stone, but it lingers as a silent question when we trace the footprints of those early migrants. Did their survival depend less on their tools than on the strange patchwork of minds that carried them? What often goes overlooked in this story is the way landscapes themselves became a stage on which different cognitive roles could shine. In open grasslands, the endurance hunter or the tracker may have been the star, reading the dust in the horizon. But when groups of Homo erectus entered denser forests or coastal estuaries, other roles would have risen to prominence. Someone attuned to the sound of rustling branches could detect hidden prey. Another with a sharp eye for shell middens or tide patterns might have been the one who ensured protein when big game failed. Even today, foraging peoples show these contrasts. Some excel in locating large prey, others in gathering shellfish or fruits, and still others in finding honey hidden high in trees. The same interplay almost certainly held true nearly 2 million years ago. There is also the quiet labour of carrying knowledge across space. Migration is not simply about walking, but about remembering where the water lies, which plants can be eaten raw, and which valleys shelter herds during the dry months. Among modern hunter-gatherers, certain individuals often act as knowledge banks, storing detailed ecological maps in memory. It is plausible that Homo erectus bands, spread thin across Asia and Africa, had their own custodians of memory, individuals who were less effective hunters but invaluable guides, keeping the group tethered to the geography of survival. Without them, groups might have wandered blindly into famine. We should also consider cooperation itself as a role requiring diverse minds. A hunt ending in a kill is only half the story. Distributing meat and maintaining peace is the other half. Someone more socially attuned, able to sense tension and diffuse conflict, may have been as critical as the hunter wielding the stone hand axe. Conflict over food could break a band apart, harmony could keep it alive. Again, variation in temperament, from the peacemaker to the assertive, likely gave early groups the tools to handle disputes before they turned catastrophic. Archaeological hints of controlled use of fire scattered across African and Asian sites in this period suggest another possibility. Those who became firekeepers may have extended their role beyond survival into the social. A fire is not only a heat source but a gathering point. Individuals inclined to sit near the flames, to tell simple stories or repeat observations, may have inadvertently bound the group together in ways that went beyond calories and warmth. These gatherings, while invisible in the fossil record, would have been fertile ground for shared memory, teaching, and the slow weaving of identity. In this light, Homo erectus was not just a pioneer of migration, but a pioneer of cognitive plurality. It was not merely strong legs and sharp tools that carried them across continents, but the coexistence of endurance chasers, cautious foragers, vigilant fire watchers, knowledge keepers, and social harmonizers. Each role was a niche in its own right, and together they allowed a fragile species to spread into nearly every corner of the old world. What kinds of minds spotted order and chaos when survival depended on it? Around 1.5 million years ago, hominins stood at a turning point. The Earth's climate lurched into colder cycles, punctuated by unpredictable swings that forced adaptability on a scale never before required. In this shifting world, the making and remaking of tools became not just a practical act, but a window into how certain individuals may have perceived the environment differently. The Acheulean hand axe, with its symmetrical teardrop shape, began to appear in Africa and beyond during this time. It was not the haphazard flake of a stone struck once in desperation. It required a mind that could see a shape hidden in raw stone, anticipate a sequence of strikes, and carry the memory of successful angles across attempts. That kind of cognition demands pattern recognition, an ability to organize chaos into a repeatable design. It is possible that some hominins had an unusual knack for this, the first pattern seekers whose vision of order exceeded the immediate need of breaking bone or skinning hide. The spread of these tools over such wide distances hints at minds not only capable of seeing patterns but of transmitting them. To craft symmetry again and again requires not only perception but teaching. The fossil record cannot tell us who those teachers were, but it can suggest that certain individuals may have excelled in noticing detail, remembering sequences, and communicating steps. In modern foragers, these roles often belong to those who may not be the fastest or strongest, but are meticulous in handwork. Perhaps the Ice Age pattern seekers were similar, individuals who took longer to hunt but contributed by carrying the blueprint of a hand axe within their minds. This skill set was more than aesthetic, it was survival. When prey herds shifted routes or seasons failed, groups needed reliable ways to extract marrow from bones, butcher animals efficiently, and cut hides for clothing. Symmetrical tools provided durability and versatility. The makers of these tools gave their groups an edge that was not brute force but foresight. One can imagine a band pausing on the move, the skilled napper at the centre, carefully turning a stone over in their hands. Others might have watched impatiently, eager to continue, but that one individual's patience meant the difference between a dull scraper and a versatile axe. Survival was thus indebted to those whose minds gravitated toward order. Climatic instability also meant the environment was full of signals waiting to be interpreted. Tracks in the snow, changes in ice, migration paths of large mammals, all were patterns. Just as some hominins became adept stoneworkers, others may have excelled at noticing animal behaviour, recognising the recurrence of seasonal shifts, or anticipating the freezing of rivers. These were not mystical leaps, but practical outcomes of paying attention. In groups where survival was fragile, having individuals tuned to pattern, even obsessively so, would have been indispensable. The fossil record offers indirect glimpses into these roles. Archaeological sites from this period show standardized toolkits with variations that reflect local adjustments. This suggests that some individuals could balance strict repetition with creative flexibility. Too rigid a mind, and one would fail to adapt when stone quality changed. Too careless, and the tool would break prematurely. What emerges is a portrait of diversity. Some individuals specialized in exacting forms, while others improvised, and together they generated a technological resilience that carried Homo erectus and their relatives across continents. The intriguing part of this story is that no one cognitive style held all the answers. A group might have included those who saw intricate order in stone, and those who thrived in the messy unpredictability of a hunt. It was this coexistence that allowed survival through long winters and erratic climates. Pattern-seeking, then, was not simply a talent but a role, one among many in the expanding theatre of the early human life. What is left in the soil are the stones they struck, but what lingers behind those stones is the impression of minds beginning to grasp the power of order in a disorderly world. The Acheulean hand axe is often cited as one of the longest-lasting technologies in human prehistory, persisting for more than 1 million years with surprisingly little modification. On the surface, that might sound like stagnation, but to look at it closely is to realize that it reflects a steady tradition of minds attuned to the idea that consistency was itself a kind of power. A hand axe found in Kenya, for instance, is nearly indistinguishable from one recovered in northern Europe hundreds of thousands of years later. This remarkable stability across both geography and time hints at a mode of thinking in which structure was sacred, a quiet insistence that repeating a known pattern was safer than chasing constant novelty. Within these communities, such individuals would have been anchors, stabilizing the group with reliable methods passed through countless generations. But uniformity was never absolute. Small variations in tool shapes reveal localized experiments, edges sharpened differently depending on the material available, or proportions tweaked for particular prey. This balance between conserving an ideal form and introducing subtle innovation speaks to the coexistence of different cognitive inclinations. Some individuals seem to thrive on holding the line, ensuring tradition was preserved. Others could not resist trying a different strike or angle, testing the limits of what stone could yield. Neither tendency was inherently superior. In harsh Ice Age environments, both were required. The conservators guaranteed that knowledge did not vanish, and the tinkerers occasionally stumbled upon improvements that helped their groups adapt to new landscapes. It is worth noting that producing an Herculean tool was not a simple act of brute force. It required foresight, dexterity, and the ability to imagine a form that did not yet exist. Archaeologists sometimes describe it as mental template technology, in which the napper had to hold an image of the finished tool in their mind, while systematically removing flakes from a raw core. That kind of visualization is no small feat. It suggests that some hominins were beginning to rehearse actions in thought before carrying them out. If certain individuals were especially adept at this, able to see the end product before the first strike, they may have been valued not just as toolmakers but as early strategists, the kind of minds that could project forward into possibilities. Beyond stone, the same skill set may have extended into broader survival. Pattern seekers who excelled at tools could also have been the ones who saw predictability in seasonal changes or noticed subtle shifts in prey movement. Archaeological sites showing repeated occupation at the same times of year suggest that groups were returning to favourable spots deliberately, perhaps guided by individuals with strong memories for cycles. This ability to detect recurrence, that rains came after certain signs, that herds passed through valleys at predictable times, was no less important than shaping a sharp edge. It was the mental glue that bound short-term survival to long-term planning. And yet, even as we speak of these cognitive gifts, it is important to remember that they were not uniformly distributed. Some individuals may have been impatient with painstaking flaking, preferring instead the immediacy of a hunt. Others might have lacked the ability to memorize long seasonal cycles, but excelled in improvising solutions when surprises emerged. What archaeology hints at is not a uniform march of cognition, but a mosaic of talents. These varied abilities spread across individuals created a social safety net. Where one mind faltered, another thrived. In that sense, the Ice Age was not simply a crucible for stronger bodies, but for diversified minds. Groups survived not because everyone thought the same way, but precisely because they did not. Some built order into stone, others lived comfortably in chaos. Together, they endured. What if the desire to walk over the horizon was not just an accident of environment, but a trait that lived inside some minds more than others? Between 800,000 and 500,000 years ago, the story of human ancestors became a story of movement. Fossils of Homo erectus and related species begin to appear not only across Africa, but in Europe and into the far reaches of Asia. It is tempting to see this only as a response to shifting climates or dwindling resources, but behind those forces were choices made by individuals and groups. Someone had to be the first to leave the known valley, to push across dry steppe or through mountain passes. Curiosity and restlessness, far from being mere quirks, may have been survival strategies in themselves. The fossil record of this time gives us tantalizing glimpses of populations stretched across continents. Herculean tools, so consistent in their symmetry, turn up in places as distant as India and northern Europe. Their presence suggests that knowledge and bodies moved together, carried by small bands who were willing to exchange the familiar for the unknown. These dispersals were not fast in the way we imagine migrations today. A few kilometers gained in a generation might be all it took, but across hundreds of thousands of years, such incremental movement redrew the map of hominin existence. The restless impulse multiplied into geography itself. What drives such behavior in animals today offers some clues. In many species, variation exists between individuals that are more cautious and those that are more exploratory. Songbirds, for example, show consistent differences. Some remain close to their nesting grounds, others roam far and wide in search of resources. Primates too exhibit similar divides. with bolder individuals often at the front of foraging expeditions while more hesitant companions hang back. The parallel is hard to ignore. If our close relatives today embody a spectrum of risk tolerance, it is reasonable to imagine that Homo erectus and its contemporaries did as well. Those who were more cautious may have provided stability, guarding what was known and keeping groups anchored. But those who were more willing to push forward, to test a new route, to try water from an unfamiliar stream, to follow a herd over a ridge, could have opened opportunities that ensured long-term survival. Without them, populations might have remained trapped in shrinking ecological pockets. With them, the range of our ancestors expanded, carrying knowledge and genetic diversity into new territories. Risk-taking, then, may have been less about reckless curiosity and more about securing the future. It is also worth noting that migration required more than one kind of boldness. Physical stamina and planning mattered, but so did social resilience. Leaving home meant negotiating new alliances and facing unfamiliar dangers. The individuals best suited to lead such movements may have been those who combined a tolerance for uncertainty with the ability to keep groups cohesive under stress. In this way, the restlessness that pushed people outward was balanced by personalities that could manage the strains of novelty, maintaining trust while horizons shifted. Archaeological finds at sites like Boxgrove in England or Dmanisi in Georgia hint at these dynamics. Each location represents not just a point on a map, but a decision made long ago to cross rivers and climb ridges. Behind the stone flakes and butchered bones lies the imprint of minds willing to step away from what was safe. For them, survival was not guaranteed, but staying put might have been no safer. Movement, even at great cost, became a gamble some were wired to take. In this period of deep prehistory, humanity's map was already being written, not only by glaciers, droughts, and herds, but by the diversity of minds. Some content to remain in the old valley, others compelled to see what lay beyond the next. That contrast may have been the quiet engine that turned scattered bands of hominins into a global story. This same era also invites us to think about the environments that rewarded wanderers and punished those who clung too tightly to the familiar. Climate instability was the backdrop to nearly everything hominins faced between 800,000 and 500,000 years ago. Glacial cycles were intensifying, with cold stages advancing and retreating in increasingly dramatic swings. A valley lush with resources one century could be barren the next. Populations that relied too heavily on fixed routines may have been stranded by these shifts, while those with an instinct to keep moving may have fared better. Restlessness, in that sense, was not merely tolerated but selected for. The ones who always had an eye toward the horizon may have become the ancestors who endured. One of the remarkable aspects of dispersal is that it did not unfold uniformly across the landscape. Some groups remained in core refuges, honing skills for stability, while others drifted into frontiers where they faced novel predators, prey, and climates. This unevenness is important. It suggests that not every population had the same behavioural profile, and that the survival of the genus as a whole may have depended on a patchwork of strategies. The homebodies and the explorers together created a dynamic that allowed resilience in the face of repeated upheavals. If one population collapsed, another might already be established somewhere else, carrying the lineage forward. Even the technologies of this era hint at this divide. Acheulean hand axes, with their standardized form, speak to conservatism and reliability, but their appearance across 3 continents also speaks to the boldness of those who carried them. In every tool that turns up thousands of kilometers from its point of origin, we see the fusion of 2 tendencies: the compulsion to keep a tradition alive and the compulsion to test new ground. Neither could have succeeded without the other. A hand axe only travels if someone dares to walk. There is also the matter of what this movement did to the minds of those who embarked on it. Crossing mountains and deserts, following rivers to their unknown ends demanded flexibility. Those inclined to novelty-seeking may have begun to see unpredictability not as a threat but as a condition of life. This psychological shift, subtle and invisible in the fossil record, may have been as significant as any stone innovation. By the time hominins reached the cold plains of northern Europe or the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, they were not just migrants. They were specialists in adaptation itself. Seen this way, wanderlust was not a distraction from survival, but a survival trait in its own right. The urge to leave, the itch to keep walking, may have been as crucial to our evolutionary story as the ability to shape stone or share food. The world that we now cover with maps was once stitched together step by step, carried on the legs and in the minds of those who could not stay put. What if survival was not only about the strongest hunter or the quickest runner, but also about the capacity to care for those who could not easily keep up? Between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago, the archaeological record begins to show something unexpected. It is not just the bones of those who died young and strong that appear in the sediments, but also skeletons of individuals who lived with severe injuries, chronic illnesses or deformities, people who by all accounts would have struggled to fend for themselves in a brutal Ice Age world. Their survival into adulthood implies that someone fed them, sheltered them, and protected them. This is one of the earliest signs that variation in empathy, tolerance, and caregiving became part of our evolutionary toolkit. At sites across Africa and Eurasia from this time frame, skeletal remains reveal a quiet revolution in social behaviour. One famous example comes from a hominin jawbone showing advanced tooth loss, yet the individual lived for years without the ability to chew effectively. To persist in such a condition, this person must have been given softer foods or had others sharing what they could. This is not evidence of sentiment in the modern sense, but it does suggest that groups allowed resources to be distributed to individuals who contributed less in obvious ways. Such acts may have been pragmatic, preserving a relative who still offered knowledge or companionship, but they point to minds capable of weighing long-term social value over immediate utility. The range of variation in tolerance is hard to see in fossils, but it almost certainly existed. Some groups may have been more willing than others to keep their infirm alive, just as today some individuals are naturally more empathetic than others. What matters is that the spectrum itself was present. In a small band, a particularly caring individual might tip the balance toward the survival of a weak child or an injured elder. Over generations, such differences may have spread through social learning, reinforcing a culture of care. It is humbling to think that the seeds of our complex moral sense may have sprouted not from abstract principles, but from countless small acts of feeding and protecting. This willingness to tolerate variation extended beyond injury. It may also have included personalities that were less obviously productive, individuals less skilled at hunting or gathering but more inclined to watch children, to calm disputes, or to remember seasonal signs. In bands of only a few dozen, every role mattered. Keeping a wide range of minds alive may have given groups a broader palette of strategies when conditions shifted. A tolerant society was not simply kind, it was resilient. Archaeologists often caution against overinterpretation, but the convergence of evidence, healed bones, toothless jaws, individuals who lived long past what seems practical, suggests that some form of social glue was already holding groups together. That glue was made not just of shared food or cooperative hunts, but of empathy in its many shades. Not everyone may have carried it equally, but enough did to leave traces in the record that still speak to us across 500,000 years. The story of caregiving in deep time is not only about bones that healed, but about the webs of interaction they hint at. If one imagines a group of early hominins sitting around a fire or huddled beneath a rocky outcrop, it is clear that survival was more than an individual affair. Food had to be shared, protection had to be coordinated, and watchfulness had to be distributed across all members. In such conditions, even subtle differences in social sensitivity or willingness to engage in caretaking could have ripple effects that reached far beyond a single life. The archaeological record, fragmentary though it is, invites us to think of societies where not every person was expected to conform to a narrow mould of usefulness, but where variations in temperament and empathy created a fabric strong enough to carry the vulnerable. One line of evidence comes from the kinds of injuries we find preserved. Some skeletal remains show signs of severe trauma, like broken limbs or crushed skulls, that would have left the victim immobile for weeks. In a purely individualistic system, such an injury would likely have meant death within days. Yet these individuals lived long enough for bones to knit, sometimes crookedly, sometimes almost completely, showing that others must have slowed down, adjusted their foraging routes, or redistributed responsibilities so the wounded could recover. These adjustments suggest that tolerance and patience were already qualities some individuals brought to the group. In a world where each mouth counted, this was not a trivial choice. Care may also have been extended through emotional support, though we can only infer it indirectly. The act of staying close to an injured person, of guarding them from predators while they could not run, is itself a form of empathy, and empathy may have varied. Some minds could more easily perceive distress and respond to it, while others may have remained more detached. In a small community, this mixture of temperaments would be visible every day. The key insight is that such variation was not necessarily a flaw. A blend of more nurturing and more pragmatic dispositions may have balanced the group, preventing it from swinging too far toward cold calculation or unrestrained generosity. Another clue comes from the lifespan of individuals who show signs of congenital conditions. Fossils exist of hominins with spinal deformities, cranial anomalies, or other conditions that would have limited their mobility from birth. These individuals sometimes survived into adolescence or adulthood, which is striking. Their existence means they were fed, sheltered, and included despite obvious physical limitations. To us that reads as compassion, but in evolutionary terms it is also strategy. Keeping every mind alive preserved knowledge, experience, and companionship, all vital resources when climates shifted unpredictably and predators lurked close. Some researchers argue that these cases may reflect cultural learning. Once one generation tolerated difference, the practice could be copied by the next, becoming part of the group's identity. This suggests that empathy was not simply a biological reflex but a social habit, cultivated and reinforced by repeated acts of care. If so, then variation in caregiving tendencies could have been one of the earliest forms of cultural diversity, different groups leaning more heavily on tolerance or exclusion, shaping their fates accordingly. The implications are profound. If wide bands of empathy and tolerance were present hundreds of thousands of years ago, then the roots of our moral lives are not recent inventions. They belong to the same evolutionary stage that produced fire, long-distance travel, and stone tools. And just as no two stone tools were ever chipped in precisely the same way, no two minds bent toward compassion in the same degree. The spectrum of human social sensitivity, stretching from the fiercely self-protective to the deeply nurturing, was already shaping the survival of our ancestors long before they painted caves or carved statues. The survival of the weak tells us something fundamental. Natural selection was not a simple filter for the fittest individual, but also a test of the flexibility of groups. To carry a person who could not carry themselves was to take a gamble that diversity of minds and bodies would one day pay off. The evidence suggests that gamble was taken again and again, and against the odds, it worked. Imagine a cold European plain some 200,000 years ago. Bands of stocky hominins moved carefully through forests and river valleys, their eyes trained on the movement of herds. These were the Neanderthals, a lineage that thrived across Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, leaving behind not only bones but also quiet hints that their ways of thinking were not inferior but different. When we approach their story today, we must resist the temptation to frame them as half-finished versions of ourselves. Instead, it may be more accurate to think of them as another branch of the human experiment, shaped by environments, challenges, and social structures that demanded particular cognitive strengths. Archaeological sites suggest that Neanderthals had remarkable spatial awareness and memory. Caves and open-air settlements reveal patterns of repeated use, as if groups returned to familiar shelters year after year. To navigate Ice Age Europe, remembering where to find resources would have been crucial. Flint outcrops, reindeer migration routes, and seasonal water sources were not scattered randomly, but were embedded in a mental map that individuals had to maintain and pass along. That map was not a drawing, but a living memory of the land, and it hints at minds tuned to spatial detail and long-term recall. Their hunting strategies tell a similar story. Evidence from sites like La Côte de Saint-Brelade in Jersey suggests that Neanderthals were capable of coordinating large-scale hunts, possibly driving herds of mammoths or other animals toward natural traps such as ravines. This required anticipation of animal behavior, cooperation among hunters, and the capacity to sustain attention across extended tasks. While we often highlight Homo sapiens as the great innovators, Neanderthals appear to have honed the ability to apply consistent, reliable strategies in landscapes where mistakes could mean starvation. Tool specialization also reflects their distinct cognitive style. Mousterian stone tools, the characteristic technology of Neanderthals, were not crude but carefully prepared through a method called Levallois flaking. This required striking a core stone in a planned sequence to produce flakes of a predetermined shape. The repetition of this method across thousands of sites suggests a strong tradition of skill transmission, where precision mattered more than constant reinvention. Perhaps their minds were oriented towards stability and mastery rather than novelty. That is not a lesser way of thinking. It's a different balance between exploration and reliability. There are also signs that Neanderthals engaged in behaviours requiring foresight beyond immediate survival. Cut marks on animal bones sometimes suggest the storage or delayed consumption of food. Pigments and shells found at certain sites point to an awareness of aesthetics, even if modest compared to later cave paintings. These traces show that Neanderthals did not live only in the moment. They managed time and resources with care, adjusting to the cycles of their environment. Importantly, fossil evidence indicates that Neanderthals also cared for members of their groups who were injured or disabled. Some skeletons bear healed fractures that would have incapacitated individuals for months, implying that others provided food and protection. This is consistent with a form of social intelligence that prioritized group survival over ruthless competition. Variation in how individuals contributed, whether through hunting, toolmaking, or caregiving, could have been accommodated within their social systems. When we look at Neanderthals this way, not as foils to us but as successful humans in their own right, the question shifts. Perhaps they embodied a cognitive style shaped by Ice Age Europe: resilient memory, disciplined attention, and mastery of practical skills. They endured for far longer than our own species has yet existed. If they ultimately disappeared, it was not because they lacked minds, but because history unfolded in ways that favoured different balances of traits. Their story reminds us that the human mind has never been singular. Across deep time, it has taken many forms, each adapted to the challenges of survival, each valid in its own context. To deepen the picture of Neanderthal minds, it helps to look at the subtle traces of daily life that rarely make headlines, but quietly challenge stereotypes. At sites such as Shanidar Cave in Iraq, excavations revealed not only burials but possible hints of deliberate placement of flowers or plant remains with the deceased. While some scholars caution that rodents could have brought in these plants, others argue the evidence still leans toward intentionality. If Neanderthals did indeed place fragrant or colourful plants alongside their dead, that act would suggest more than practicality. It may indicate that some individuals in their groups were attuned to symbolic gestures, small moments of meaning woven into the fabric of survival. Equally telling are discoveries of Neanderthal-built structures inside deep caves in France. At Bruniquel Cave, researchers uncovered circular arrangements of broken stalagmites, carefully stacked into rings, dating back around 170,000 years. These constructions were not simple shelters. They were too deep in the cave to serve daily needs. Their purpose remains mysterious, but the effort required to gather, break, and arrange heavy stone columns points to planning and shared goals. It also reveals a willingness to explore dark, enclosed spaces, an environment that demands a distinct kind of courage and curiosity. Such behaviour hints that cognitive variation within their groups may have included individuals inclined to risk unusual ventures, while others remained anchored in routine. Dietary evidence adds another layer to this diversity. For a long time, Neanderthals were depicted as heavy meat-eaters, hunting large animals almost exclusively. Yet residue analysis on fossilised dental plaque shows traces of cooked plants, nuts, and even medicinal herbs like yarrow or chamomile. These finds suggest that some individuals experimented with plants not for calories, but for other effects, perhaps bitter tastes or soothing properties. To recognise and select such plants implies an observational mindset, one that paid attention to subtleties in the environment and shared that knowledge with others. In this way, the Neanderthal record whispers of dietary and medicinal innovators among them, the odd minds who noticed details others overlooked. Genetic studies also hint at neurological differences. Variations in Neanderthal genomes linked to cranial development and sensory perception suggest that their brains may have processed information differently from ours. For instance, some evidence indicates heightened sensitivity in visual and somatosensory systems. This could mean that Neanderthal individuals experienced their surroundings with greater intensity of sight or touch, shaping how they interacted with tools, environments, and each other. Rather than assuming deficiency, it might be more accurate to imagine a population where perceptual worlds varied more widely than in ours, with some excelling in navigation through dim forests and others in fine manipulation of stone or bone. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a species that embodied a spectrum of cognitive profiles, adapted to cold climates, scattered groups, and demanding ecologies. They organised space in patterned ways, experimented with materials, remembered landscapes across generations, and may have imbued moments of life and death with gestures that transcended necessity. It is easy, from the vantage of the present, to measure them against ourselves and find gaps. But their endurance across 300,000 years suggests that their mental diversity was functional, effective, and sufficient for survival until new historical currents swept across Eurasia. Their story ultimately widens our definition of what it means to be human. Minds need not all converge on the same strengths. Some thrive in repetition and memory, others in improvisation and novelty. Neanderthals, like us, appear to have housed both types, and perhaps that very variation allowed them to leave so many distinct traces behind. In considering their cognitive lives, we are reminded that humanity has never been a single way of thinking, but an orchestra of approaches, each shaped by environment, circumstance, and the unpredictable arc of history. Around 200,000 years ago, the African landscape was already crowded with many kinds of hominins, and among them were the first populations of what we now call Homo sapiens. These early people did not live in large cities or sprawling empires. They lived in small bands, often no more than a few dozen individuals, dependent on the land and on each other. In such communities, survival was not simply about having strong hunters or fast runners. It was about having a mixture of people whose minds and aptitudes allowed them to handle different and sometimes very specific roles. Variation in their skills and focus was not a luxury. It was the difference between thriving and vanishing in environments that could change suddenly and without mercy. Archaeological traces from sites across Africa hint at this emerging specialization. Stone tools become more varied during this period, with some crafted for piercing, others for scraping hides, and still others for preparing plant matter. The production of these tools was not evenly distributed. Some individuals clearly excelled in shaping stone more precisely, suggesting that a talent for patience, repetition, and fine motor skills may have set them apart. For a small group, having one or two members who could reliably make effective tools would have been invaluable, allowing others to focus on foraging, gathering plants, or navigating the terrain. These were likely the first specialists, not in the sense of rigid professions, but in the way that cognitive variation allowed individuals to lean into their strengths. Memory may have been another form of specialization. In a world without writing, the survival of knowledge depended on those who could recall details across long stretches of time. The memory keepers of these groups may have remembered the location of distant waterholes, the timing of migrations, or the uses of specific plants. Fossil pollen and seed remain suggest that early Homo sapiens consumed a broad spectrum of plant life, some of which carried medicinal or toxic properties. To experiment safely required observational skill, but to preserve that knowledge demanded long-term recall and the ability to communicate patterns. Those whose minds naturally clung to details others might forget may have been entrusted with the role of guiding foraging decisions, carrying invisible libraries inside their heads. Navigators, too, may have emerged as unique contributors. The expansion of Homo sapiens across varied African landscapes demanded not only stamina but also orientation. Without compasses or maps, these early humans relied on landmarks, seasonal winds, and the behaviour of animals to move across savannas, forests, and coasts. Some individuals likely excelled in spatial mapping, holding in mind large territories and connecting disparate places. This kind of cognitive variation meant that even small groups could stretch their range, confident that at least one member could retrace paths or find new routes when resources ran dry. Herbalists or plant experts were another probable form of specialization. Charred plant remains from hearths at sites such as Border Cave and Sibadu in South Africa reveal that early sapiens were not passive consumers, but selective foragers. Some plants show signs of roasting or processing, which reduces toxins or improves digestibility. The knowledge behind these practices did not fall evenly across the community. It likely rested with those individuals whose curiosity drew them to experiment with roots, leaves, and seeds. In environments where food stress could mean the difference between life and death, these subtle differences in inclination created an edge for the group as a whole. The importance of these specialists lies not in imagining them as solitary geniuses, but as members of a mosaic where every cognitive style mattered. Groups that tolerated and encouraged these variations may have been more resilient than those that expected uniformity. In this sense, diversity of minds was a form of insurance policy against the unpredictability of climate and landscape. It was not always the strongest or the most daring who carried the group forward, but often the focused, the careful, the observant, and the patient. To think of early sapiens this way is to see that neurodiversity, though we cannot yet use the modern terms, was not a late development, but a condition of survival from the beginning. Minds that worked differently gave small groups the ability to cover multiple ecological niches at once, to explore the world in ways that no single temperament could have managed alone. Far from being an exception, variation was the rule, and specialization was its natural outcome. The archaeological record also reminds us that specialization was not limited to technical skills, but extended into social and emotional domains. Within a band of early sapiens, not everyone contributed equally to every task, yet the cohesion of the group was maintained. This suggests that some individuals may have excelled at mediating disputes, calming tensions, or reinforcing cooperation during moments of stress. Fossil evidence of long-term group stability in particular sites points to a social structure that allowed multiple roles to coexist, not just hunters and toolmakers, but also peacemakers and negotiators. The ability to balance competing personalities and needs was as vital as knowing how to knap stone or prepare food. Fire use during this period also deepened the space for specialization. Hearths show controlled use of fire for cooking and warmth, but also hint at extended evening gatherings. In such moments, there would have been opportunities for those with strong narrative memory or teaching skills to shape the group's identity. Some may have been especially skilled at retelling events, weaving lessons into stories that carried information across generations. These early storytellers may have been as essential to survival as the hunters, preserving knowledge in a format that the group could easily recall and transmit. Even before symbolic art, oral transmission required minds comfortable with abstraction, rhythm, and sequence. What makes this period especially fascinating is how these different aptitudes seem to cluster in small groups, suggesting that the flexibility of early sapiens lay not just in their anatomy, but in their cognitive distribution. A group could afford to have one person less skilled in hunting if another's contribution in medicine, navigation, or diplomacy compensated. The richness of this internal variation is part of why Homo sapiens began to expand more widely during this time frame, slowly preparing for the dispersals that would carry them out of Africa. Each specialist amplified the reach of the group as a whole. It is also worth noting that some of these roles demanded solitude as much as cooperation. The herbalist searching for plants might have wandered apart from the group, observing details that others overlooked. The navigator might have preferred quiet reflection to hold landscapes in mind. The toolmaker might have needed hours of patient focus while others rested or foraged. This balance between solitary focus and group reliance reveals another dimension of early human life. Specialization was not about conformity, but about recognizing that survival could be served by accommodating different rhythms and inclinations. When we look back, it is tempting to impose the neat categories of modern professions. But what truly mattered in these early bands was the flexibility to let individuals follow their natural inclinations, when those inclinations produced something of value to everyone else. It was a fragile but powerful arrangement. Fragile because losing a single specialist could threaten survival, but powerful because together they formed a system more adaptive than any one mind alone could ever achieve. Around 100,000 years ago, long before the invention of writing, the human world depended on memory. In small, scattered bands of Homo sapiens, survival often hinged on whether someone could recall the details of where water could be found after a drought, when herds would return to a valley, or which plants were safe to eat in one season but dangerous in another. This was not trivial recollection. It was the preservation of life through the fragile thread of human memory. Some individuals within these groups must have stood out as the keepers of such knowledge, the ones whose minds naturally clung to detail, who carried within them a living archive. The idea that memory varied from person to person is supported not by inscriptions or manuscripts, none existed, but by the logic of survival in oral cultures. When every piece of knowledge had to be spoken aloud and heard by another, the group needed people who remembered more accurately and more completely than others. These were not merely storytellers for entertainment, but indispensable human libraries. Archaeologists studying later forager societies note how carefully information about landscapes, animal behaviour, and plant properties was passed down in song, chant, or repetitive stories. It is reasonable to think that earlier humans, facing similar challenges, also relied on those whose inclination toward detail, repetition, or obsessive recall made them natural memory keepers. Consider the demands of migration during this period. When Homo sapiens began expanding more widely within Africa, and tentatively beyond, to cross unfamiliar terrain required knowing not only the immediate environment, but also places far distant, handed down through the memories of those who had travelled there before. The individual who could hold in mind the sequence of rivers, ridges and valleys would have been a guide not because of strength, but because of mental endurance. In this way, memory became a survival skill as critical as hunting ability. What these memory keepers preserved was not limited to geography. They likely encoded practical lessons about tools, fire or medicine into narratives that could be remembered and retold. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups show that stories often weave in instructions about behaviour, warnings about overhunting certain animals, or reminders about the timing of seasonal resources. These lessons are camouflaged in narrative, making them easier to recall. For early sapiens, variation in how well individuals could learn, remember and transmit these lessons would have made the difference between a band that persisted and one that collapsed after a mistake repeated. There is also evidence that some individuals specialised in carrying the memory of kinship. The ability to recall who was related to whom across multiple generations would have been vital in avoiding inbreeding and maintaining alliances with neighbouring groups. In a world without records, someone with an exceptional memory for names, relationships and lineages may have been a safeguard for genetic health. These kinship archivists ensured that social networks remained coherent even as groups merged, split and reformed. The archaeology of this period does not give us the direct voices of these people, but traces of long-distance raw material transport suggest extensive networks. Obsidian and ochre were carried hundreds of kilometres, evidence that relationships and trade routes were remembered and renewed. The maintenance of such networks would have been impossible without people whose minds could retain not just places but the social contracts attached to them. Memory, then, was not only a private gift but a public trust, binding groups together across time and space. The fragility of this system is also striking. If a memory keeper died suddenly, the knowledge of a safe route, the timing of a migration, or the recipe for detoxifying a plant might vanish forever. This precariousness explains why oral societies often repeated key information in ritualized forms, chants, songs, or repeated phrases that embedded practical lessons in rhythm and rhyme. These mnemonic techniques distributed memory across the group, but still leaned heavily on those individuals who excelled in their recall. We might imagine them correcting others, insisting on precise wording, driven not by stubbornness but by the awareness that accuracy mattered. The broader implication is that human variation in memory and attention was not a peripheral trait, but a central organising principle of early sapient societies. Minds inclined toward detail and repetition became the vessels of accumulated knowledge. Minds oriented toward action or novelty-seeking played different roles. But without the memory keepers, those actions would lack continuity. Diversity of cognition was not an afterthought. It was the scaffolding on which culture itself began to form. The role of memory in this period was not only about accuracy, but also about endurance. Certain individuals may have had minds that naturally circled back to the same details again and again, unable to let them fade. In daily life, such a trait could have been frustrating or even distracting, but in the context of oral cultures it was profoundly useful. When others forgot, the memory keeper repeated. When a lesson was drifting out of reach, someone pulled it back through sheer compulsion to remember. Far from being a weakness, this insistence on repetition may have been one of the earliest foundations of cultural continuity. It is worth reflecting on how memory interacts with emotion. Modern psychology shows that events tied to fear, awe, or deep attachment are stored more firmly than neutral experiences. We cannot test this directly for humans living 60,000 or 100,000 years ago, but we can guess that memory keepers may have been those who are most emotionally moved by details others overlooked. Perhaps the shape of a rock outcrop, the particular call of a bird, or the scent of a blooming plant anchored itself so strongly in their minds that they could recall it years later when the group needed it. In this way, variation in how individuals processed experience meant that certain people carried not only facts, but the feelings that gave those facts their weight. We can also consider memory in terms of time depth. In small groups, most members might easily recall events of the past few seasons. But what about events of decades earlier, before younger generations were born? Someone with the ability to mentally extend the timeline further back, to hold on to the knowledge of drought cycles or ancestral migrations, would become the guardian of long-term perspective. Archaeologists studying sediment cores and faunal remains in Africa suggest that climate fluctuations were severe during this window of human prehistory. The band that knew from memory that a harsh dry period had come before, and that recovery would follow, might have had more resilience than one relying only on immediate perception. There is another dimension of memory to consider, the imaginative leap it enables. To recall with clarity is not only to preserve the past, but to project possible futures. A person who remembered the sequence of river floods could also anticipate the next one. A person who remembered the signs of animal migration could predict when the herds would return. This predictive power does not require written calendars or charts. It requires minds tuned to sequences, rhythms and cycles, and the patience to hold them across years. Those variations in cognition would not have been visible as tools or artifacts, but they were perhaps among the most valuable adaptations in early human societies. When we think of survival, we often imagine the spear wielder, the fire maker, or the swift runner. But just as critical was the one sitting by the fire, reciting for the 100th time the landmarks that would guide the group back to water, or the sequence of plants safe to eat in spring but poisonous in autumn. These invisible contributions remind us that survival was never about one kind of intelligence. It was about many kinds, woven together. And without those whose minds clung to detail and story, we might not be here at all. What if symbols were not the inevitable product of every human mind, but the rare gift of a few unusual ones? Around 80,000 to 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record begins to whisper a new kind of story. At sites across Africa and the Levant, fragments of ochre appear etched with cross-hatched patterns that serve no practical purpose. Shell beads show up perforated, strung and stained with red pigments. Bones are marked not by the cuts of butchery, but by deliberate engravings. These are not tools for cutting or scraping. They are artifacts that communicate meaning, though we do not yet know what that meaning was. And it is here that we can begin to wonder whether symbolic thinking arose from the broad population at once, or whether it was first kindled in a minority of dreamers whose imagination saw something more in pigment and pattern than the rest of their group did. When archaeologists excavated the Blombos cave in South Africa, they found ochre pieces engraved with deliberate geometric designs, dating to around 30,000 years ago, 75,000 years ago. To scratch a crosshatch into stone or pigment is an action that takes extra effort without immediate survival payoff. Such behaviour might not have emerged from the practical, cautious minds who focused on food and shelter alone. Instead, it could have come from individuals whose curiosity drew them toward abstraction, who found satisfaction not only in surviving but in leaving a mark. These engravings, tiny as they are, hint at a divergence of cognitive styles. Not everyone carving, not everyone compelled by pattern, but a few who led the way. Symbolic objects appear again and again in ways that suggest uneven adoption. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐿 cave in Israel, perforated shells with traces of red ochre suggest the wearing of beads dating back about 100,000 years. Yet in other sites from the same time, no such artifacts appear. This uneven distribution raises the possibility that symbolic minds were scattered, not universal. Perhaps in some bands, a few individuals pushed pigments into the world of communication, while in others, survival carried on with stone and fire alone. The emergence of symbolism may have depended on groups where these dreamers were tolerated, where their behaviours were allowed space to flourish rather than dismissed as strange distractions. What might have driven such symbolic impulses? One theory is that symbolic acts helped cement social identity. Wearing ochre or beads marked belonging. But another possibility is that these acts were born from internal compulsion. Some individuals may have simply seen the world differently, noticing relationships of colour and form that demanded expression. For them, ochre was not just a mineral scraped from rock, it was a canvas. Shells were not just food waste, they were beads waiting for string. These variations in perception could have been innate, part of the natural spectrum of human cognition. In that sense, symbolism may not have been a universal step, but the amplification of unusual minds, who saw patterns and stories where others saw only raw material. And yet, once symbols appeared, they spread. Beads and ochre, once introduced, could be copied and worn by those who did not invent them. This diffusion suggests that symbolic minds may have sparked ideas, but the broader group carried them forward. Cultural traditions may have begun with the few but became part of the many. The dreamers planted seeds that others tended, even if they did not share the same compulsion for abstraction. In this way, symbolic artifacts become windows into cognitive diversity, a reminder that our species' creativity may have rested not in everyone thinking alike, but in everyone tolerating and eventually adopting the strange ideas of a minority. We should be cautious not to romanticize these objects as the first art in the way museums sometimes do. To call them art imposes our modern categories on actions that may have carried entirely different meanings. They may have been practical identifiers, ritual markers, or even idle doodles. But what matters is that they point to a new kind of mind at work, one that treated the world as more than immediate necessity. And whether admired, mocked, or misunderstood, these early dreamers of symbols introduced something that reshaped what it meant to be human. The haunting thought is not only that symbols emerged, but that they might have remained unexpressed had those unusual minds been silenced or ignored. Our story may owe itself to a small number of people who dared to think in shapes, colours, and signs long before the rest of us caught on. If we follow the thread further, we begin to see how these scattered experiments with symbols may have carried a power that extended beyond the individuals who first conceived them. By 80,000 years ago, some groups were already producing objects that seemed designed to outlast their makers, objects with a durability far greater than speech or gesture. A mark carved into ochre or bone could remain visible for generations, persisting through the deaths of its creators. That endurance itself may have given symbolic behaviour a strange advantage. A spoken story fades with the breath of the speaker, but a scratched crosshatch or a string of beads could be held, worn, passed down. This permanence might have allowed ideas from unusual minds to slowly infiltrate the wider community, even among those who did not intuitively understand them at first. Archaeologists have often noted that symbolic objects tend to appear in contexts of gathering or burial, moments when groups came together and identities were reinforced. It may be that symbolic minds were not only tolerated but sometimes revered. The individuals who introduced markings and beads may have become central figures within their groups, not because everyone shared their way of thinking, but because their creations carried a mysterious authority. To see a pattern appear on stone, or to see colour worn deliberately on the body may have suggested knowledge beyond the ordinary. In that sense, symbolic thinkers may have carved out roles as innovators, advisors, or leaders, shaping social life without ever intending to. This does not mean that symbolism spread in a smooth or inevitable line. In fact, the record shows long stretches of silence, periods where symbolic artifacts seem to vanish, only to reappear thousands of years later. That rhythm suggests that symbolic expression was fragile, dependent on the survival of small clusters of individuals who thought in that particular way. If they died out, their practices might have vanished with them. But whenever these individuals reappeared in the population, whether through chance, genetics, or environment, symbolic behaviour could ignite again. In this sense, our species' creativity may not have been a steady march, but a flickering light, relit again and again by a few unusual sparks. It is tempting to look at these early symbols and imagine the beginnings of language or art, but perhaps it is enough to recognise them as the evidence of cognitive diversity deep in our past. These objects remind us that the human story has never been uniform. It has always been shaped by those who see differently, who notice details others overlook, who find significance where others see none. Without them, ochre would remain a dull rock, shells would remain discarded food, and bones would remain waste. With them, these things became markers of identity, memory, and perhaps even the first whispers of culture. The persistence of these artifacts across time tells us that the dreamers were never entirely alone. They may have been rare, but they were not without influence, and in the end their marks on stone and pigment became marks on history itself, reminding us that humanity's greatest strength may not be in sameness, but in the unlikely visions of a few. What if words themselves, not tools or weapons, were the decisive advantage as Homo sapiens spread across the world around 50,000 years ago? Archaeologists often focus on blades, beads, or bones, but there is another technology that leaves no trace in soil or stone: the voice. Unlike a hand axe, which can be excavated, the chatter of a group cannot be fossilized. Yet it may have been chatter that made all the difference. For a species trying to coordinate hunts, share knowledge of dangerous landscapes, and teach new skills, endless talk may have become a survival trait. The emergence of large interconnected groups required more than gestures and grunts. It required individuals who could not stop talking, and groups that tolerated, even relied upon, their endless flow of words. To understand this, we must imagine the scale of sapiens bands as they expanded. Earlier hominins often lived in small groups of a few dozen, but by 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were forming social networks that stretched into the hundreds, even across regions. Maintaining such vast connections required communication that was not only clear but constant. In this environment, the quiet individual who rarely spoke may have played one role, but the compulsive storyteller, the one who repeated news, gossip, and cautionary tales, became the glue that held networks together. We see hints of this in the archaeological record, not in the bones of throats or the size of skulls, but in the speed with which cultural practices spread. When ornaments, blades, or pigments appear across wide territories within a few generations, it suggests that ideas travelled fast. Ideas do not move without people moving their mouths. The spread of knowledge depended on those who could not resist repeating what they heard, embellishing it, and passing it on. In modern terms, these were the super spreaders of information, the ancestors of storytellers, teachers, and perhaps even gossipers. Their gift was not restraint, but persistence, the refusal to let an idea fade in silence. There is also a practical edge to verbal hyperactivity. Teaching a skill like knapping stone or weaving fibre requires repeated demonstration, but language multiplies teaching beyond what hands alone can show. An individual who spoke constantly could narrate actions, warn of mistakes, and emphasize key steps. This verbal redundancy may have seemed excessive at the time, but in survival terms it was invaluable. A child learning to set a trap for a hare might forget the precise placement of a trigger stick, but a parent's words, repeated 100 times, ensured that memory stuck. Excessive talk, rather than a distraction, became a kind of insurance policy against forgetting. The expansion of sapiens also depended on navigating unknown environments, from deserts to tundra. Here, communication styles mattered as much as physical endurance. Groups had to pass on precise details: where to find a hidden spring, which berries poisoned the gut, which valley was inhabited by rivals. Individuals with unusually strong verbal recall and a compulsion to share it became walking archives. They were the living equivalent of written records, and their tendency to speak at length ensured that crucial information was heard by everyone, even those who were not listening carefully. It is easy to overlook this kind of cognitive diversity because voices do not fossilize. Yet we know from modern small-scale societies that communication styles vary widely. Some individuals thrive in silence, contributing little unless asked. Others dominate conversation, weaving complex narratives that range from the practical to the poetic. In societies where survival hinged on the sharing of knowledge, those loquacious individuals may have given their groups an advantage. keeping ideas alive long after a quieter band might have let them fade. Of course, endless talking could be annoying. We can imagine the eye rolls, the sighs, the moments when a group member wandered off rather than listen again to the same warning about which mushrooms to avoid. But survival does not always align with comfort. The chatterers ensured that vital information was never lost, and their redundancy built resilience into the collective memory of their groups. When Homo sapiens began outcompeting other hominins in Eurasia, the difference may not have been sharper blades or stronger muscles, but a kind of verbal persistence that turned human groups into networks of information far greater than the sum of their parts. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is how this variation in communication styles mirrors what we see today. Some people thrive in silence and detail, others in endless narration. Both roles matter. Both have always mattered. And in the late Pleistocene, it may have been the unstoppable voices that carried the stories, the warnings, and the instructions that allowed sapiens not only to survive, but to expand into nearly every corner of the earth. If we step back for a moment, it is worth considering just how unusual it is for any animal to rely so heavily on voice. Among primates, most vocalizations are short, functional, and highly context-driven. An alarm call warns of a predator, a food call signals abundance, a grunt reassures. But by 50,000 years ago, sapiens appear to have leaned into an entirely different mode. Conversation as a constant hum that went far beyond immediate need. This transformation was not just about producing sounds, but about sustaining them in long chains, filled with description, speculation, and repetition. The archaeological traces of a long-distance exchange, shells travelling hundreds of kilometres inland, pigments appearing far from their sources, suggest that information was travelling alongside objects. Someone had to tell others where the shells came from, how to grind the pigment, and what these things signified. And those someones were likely individuals who simply could not stop talking. We can also imagine the role of verbal hyperactivity in maintaining group cohesion at night. Around a fire, when predators lurked in the dark, speech filled the silence that might otherwise have bred fear. Constant chatter reassured the group, reminded them of bonds, and allowed new alliances to be negotiated. The talkers were not only conveyors of information but mediators of anxiety. Their words wove a fabric of familiarity that dulled the sharp edge of danger. It is easy to overlook the psychological function of endless speaking, but in environments where survival was fragile, reassurance was as valuable as knowledge. There may also have been an adaptive value in variation itself. Not every group needed everyone to be talkative. A balance between quiet observers and relentless speakers likely created resilience. Those who preferred silence could excel at stealth hunting or solitary observation, while the chatterers ensured that discoveries made by the quiet were amplified and shared. In this way, diversity of communication style became a collective advantage. It allowed information to move in two stages: discovered quietly, spread loudly. Neither role alone would have been sufficient. The evolutionary success of Homo sapiens is sometimes explained in terms of brain size, symbolic thought, or technological innovation. Yet the role of conversation deserves equal attention. A tool forgotten is a tool lost, but a tool described, demonstrated, and repeated in words becomes a tradition. Language alone did not ensure survival. It had to be carried by individuals compelled to use it, over and over again. These compulsive voices acted as engines of cultural transmission, even when they irritated those around them. In the end, the survival of sapiens in such diverse landscapes may have rested less on grand inventions than on the humble persistence of words. The people who kept speaking when others grew tired may have been the ones who ensured that vital knowledge never vanished. Their chatter was not a flaw but a lifeline, and so the voices that did not stop became the voices that carried our species into new worlds. When Homo sapiens first walked into Neanderthal lands around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, the meeting was not just a clash of populations but a meeting of different kinds of minds. For almost 200,000 years before this encounter, Neanderthals had shaped their world with their own rhythms of thought, their own preferences for tools, hunting strategies, and ways of inhabiting the land. Sapiens, arriving from Africa and the Levant, brought a different set of traditions and tendencies. The archaeological record gives us no transcripts of their conversations and no direct window into their thoughts, but it does give us material traces, the stone and bone left behind, and from these we can glimpse the diversity of cognition that existed side by side. Neanderthals favoured what archaeologists call the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐿𝐿 a method of shaping stone by preparing a core and then striking flakes with precise control. This was not random flaking, but a highly systematic approach that required planning, patience, and spatial reasoning. The result was sturdy, reliable flakes for cutting and scraping, well suited to a life that involved dismembering large animals and working hides. Sapiens, in contrast, increasingly leaned toward blade technology, long, slender flakes struck from prepared cores, which could be further retouched into a variety of shapes. This allowed for specialization and standardization, a modular toolkit that could be adapted to many purposes. Neither system was superior in absolute terms. Each reflected a different balance of priorities, Neanderthals perhaps favouring strength and durability, sapiens favouring flexibility and innovation. Hunting strategies reveal similar contrasts. Neanderthal remains are often associated with sites where groups drove large game, such as mammoths or bison, into ambushes. This required intimate knowledge of local terrain and close coordination, often at great personal risk. Injuries preserved in Neanderthal skeletons suggest frequent direct contact with large animals, implying a hunting style that was brave, perhaps even reckless, but certainly effective for short bursts of high-calorie return. Sapiens, on the other hand, appear to have relied more often on endurance hunting, persistence over long distances, and a wider diet that included smaller animals and more gathered plants. These strategies required patience, planning across time, and the ability to coordinate pursuit over wide landscapes. Again, neither style proves one species smarter than the other. They simply reflect different ecological adaptations and perhaps different cognitive emphases. What we see here is diversity in action. To imagine a Neanderthal and a sapiens sitting side by a fire is to imagine two minds that structured problems differently. The Neanderthal might have excelled in spatial memory, recalling every contour of a familiar valley, knowing exactly where herds would move season after season. The sapiens might have been more inclined to experiment with new tools, to push into unfamiliar terrain with strategies that carried higher risk, but also higher reward. Their meeting was not a hierarchy, but a juxtaposition of approaches. The fact that sapiens ultimately spread further does not erase the remarkable success of Neanderthals, who survived for hundreds of thousands of years in some of the harshest climates on Earth. Archaeological finds suggest moments of overlap that were not simply conflict. At certain sites, tools traditionally associated with sapiens appear alongside Neanderthal remains, and vice versa. This raises the possibility of knowledge exchange, of ideas flowing between groups. Perhaps Neanderthals observed sapiens' blade technology and experimented with it themselves. Perhaps sapiens adopted aspects of Neanderthal hunting strategies. If so, then the meeting of these species was not only a collision, but also a blending of minds, however temporary. The most humbling lesson here is that diversity of thought existed long before modern categories of culture or race. Around 50,000 years ago, the Earth held not one way of being human but several, each adapted to its own ecological niche, each demonstrating that survival could be achieved through different balances of caution and curiosity, strength and flexibility, memory and innovation. To frame Neanderthals as failed versions of ourselves misses the point. They were a testament to the fact that humanity itself has always been plural. The question their story leaves us with is not whether they were less than us, but how much richer the human lineage once was when different kinds of minds truly walked the same ground. If we peer more closely at the archaeological record of this meeting, what stands out is not just the contrast of tools or hunting styles, but the landscapes of knowledge that shaped them. Neanderthals, deeply rooted in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, carried a kind of memory written into their bones. Their survival depended on knowing every cave, every ridge, and every migration corridor of the animals they hunted. This was a knowledge honed over generations, passed not through maps or symbols, but through lived familiarity with place. Sapiens, arriving from further south, often entered landscapes with less inherited memory. They compensated not by carrying an encyclopedic knowledge of one valley, but by creating strategies that allowed them to improvise and explore beyond it. This difference may have manifested in the material traces of their camps. Neanderthal sites often show heavy investment in local resources, with thick accumulations of stone tools made from nearby quarries, bones processed on site, and hearths rebuilt again and again in the same shelters. Sapiens sites, by contrast, sometimes contain raw materials imported from tens or even hundreds of kilometres away. This suggests a mobility pattern that leaned on exchange networks or deliberate exploration. To live in one place for decades cultivates depth of knowledge. To move constantly cultivates breadth. These are not better or worse cognitive styles, but complementary ways of engaging with the environment. We also catch glimpses of difference in the scale of social worlds. Neanderthals may have lived in smaller, tightly knit bands, perhaps a few dozen individuals at most. Such groups would rely on strong bonds and finely tuned cooperation. Their cognition may have favoured the immediate and the tangible. Who was injured, who was capable of hunting, who remembered last winter's storm. Sapiens, in contrast, seem to have operated in wider social webs, with ornaments and pigments functioning as tokens of identity across groups. This broader connectivity required an emphasis on communication across distance, on maintaining relationships beyond the immediate band. When these two ways of living met, they likely saw in each other both the strengths and the strangeness of unfamiliar minds. It is important not to imagine these encounters as static. For thousands of years, sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted across overlapping ranges. This means that young children may have grown up hearing stories of the others nearby. Hunters may have observed each other across valleys, and perhaps there were exchanges of knowledge far more subtle than stone tool traditions can reveal. Each group would have represented to the other an alternate way of being human. Proof that survival could be achieved through a different balance of thought, habit, and adaptation. The silence of the record leaves us guessing at what impressions were left. Did sapiens view Neanderthals as unimaginative but reliable, steady in their mastery of place? Did Neanderthals view sapiens as reckless wanderers, trying too many new tricks and risking too much? We cannot know, but it is worth sitting with the possibility that neither view would have been entirely wrong. What mattered most was that diversity itself existed, that the Pleistocene world was not dominated by one kind of mind, but enriched by the coexistence of several. That richness is now gone, and with it, an entire way of thinking that we can only reconstruct from stone, bone, and ash. The loss reminds us not of our superiority, but of how narrow our lineage has become. What if sleeplessness itself was one of the hidden engines of human culture? Around 40,000 years ago, as Homo sapiens spread across Eurasia, nights were long, dark, and filled with dangers. Predators moved under cover of shadow, rival groups could appear suddenly, and the cold alone could threaten survival. In such a world, not everyone could afford to fall into deep slumber at once. Someone had to remain alert beside the fire, watching embers and listening for sounds in the night. These were not always volunteers. Sometimes they were the ones who simply could not sleep, the restless individuals whose minds spun long after others had drifted off. What might look like a flaw today, insomnia, hyperfocus, an inability to settle, may have been a hidden advantage for our ancestors. Archaeologists have found traces of repeated hearth use deep in caves and rock shelters, blackened walls and ash layers that show fire was not just kindled by day but maintained through the long hours of darkness. To keep a fire alive is a delicate task, requiring the steady addition of fuel at intervals, attention to the shift of smoke, and the awareness to wake others if danger approached. Who performed this work? Likely it was those who remained awake while others slept, whether by choice or by restless necessity. Their sleepless nights kept the group warm and safe. In small bands, such wakefulness could have been the difference between survival and disaster. Predators rarely attack groups that appear alert, but the glow of a fire left untended could fade into ash before dawn. A single sleepless individual, pacing or poking embers, ensured continuity. Over time, this variation in sleep patterns may have been favoured, not punished. Different circadian rhythms meant that across the night there was always someone half awake, someone ready to hear a twig snap or see eyes glint in the dark. Modern studies of hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza in Tanzania show that this still occurs. In a typical camp, at almost every hour of the night, someone is awake, whether because of age, restlessness, or temperament. Complete vulnerability, it seems, is rare in human communities. But sleeplessness was not only about vigilance. What do restless minds do when silence stretches and sleep will not come? They talk, they think, they imagine. It is easy to picture how stories may have begun in such hours, when the fire's glow flickered against the walls and only a handful of listeners remained awake. The quiet of the night, punctuated by voice and flame, created a space where tales could grow longer and stranger. The restless talkers of the night may have been the first storytellers, weaving memory and imagination into narratives that filled time and soothed anxiety. Their insomnia became a cultural resource. Hyperfocus too may have played a role. For some, night offered a chance to work stone or bone with an intensity that daylight interruptions prevented. Archaeological finds of finely retouched blades and intricately carved ornaments suggest the patience of minds willing to sit for hours absorbed in a task. Such concentration, coupled with sleeplessness, may have turned what might seem a weakness into a form of mastery. Where others surrendered to fatigue, the insomniacs and obsessives refined tools, rehearsed stories, and guarded fires. The broader implication is that cognitive variation extended even into our relationship with sleep. Not all humans were built to rest the same way, and this difference itself gave groups a survival edge. Those who slept deeply recovered strength. Those who did not became watchers and keepers of continuity. Together, they created resilience. Today, sleeplessness is often pathologized as disorder, but in deep prehistory it may have been an essential thread in the tapestry of human survival. Without the wakeful ones, fires might have gone out, predators might have crept too close, and perhaps some of the first long stories might never have been told. There is another layer to this story of sleepless nights, one that hints at how variation in human minds might have shaped culture as much as survival. While some sat awake to tend fire or carve tools, others may have used the hours to share memories, strategies, or knowledge that would otherwise be drowned out by the noise of daytime activity. The stillness of night makes people speak differently. Whispers replace shouts, and words often turn toward the reflective rather than the practical. In this environment, those who stayed awake may have helped their groups process the day, retell what had been learned on the hunt, or pass on information about routes, plants, or dangers. Restless nights became informal schools, teaching the next day's survivors in the glow of fading coals. There is also evidence that light from fire itself changed the rhythm of our species. Unlike moonlight or starlight, fire could extend usable hours well beyond sunset. The simple act of sitting together in its glow may have altered hormones and circadian cues, giving some individuals an edge in thriving during irregular cycles. The relationship between firelight and sleeplessness is still studied today, as melatonin suppression by artificial light is a modern concern. Yet in prehistory this may have been precisely what allowed the emergence of new cultural activities after dark. Not everyone's body responded the same way. Some may have felt drowsy, while others stayed alert and restless. This divergence within a group created a natural division of labour across the night. Anthropologists sometimes call this the sentinel hypothesis, suggesting that human variation in sleep depth and timing evolved to prevent the dangers of a camp being simultaneously unconscious. But beyond safety, the hypothesis implies an evolutionary space for those wired to live at the margins of the circadian cycle. In essence, the sleepless ones were not maladaptive, they were essential. The band could afford to sleep only because someone else could not. And when we think about how much of human identity is built on sharing ideas, it is not hard to imagine that the dark hours around the fire gave rise to the very first experiments in abstract thought. To tell a story at night is different from telling it at midday. Shadows make words heavier. The fire turns ordinary objects into shapes that seem alive, and memory slips more easily into imagination. Those whose brains were prone to wakefulness, to obsessive thought loops, to deep focus at night, may have provided the fertile ground for narrative traditions. Their insomnia was not a curse, but a quiet workshop of culture. What remains humbling is how even something as uncomfortable as restless nights can be reframed as part of our shared survival strategy. The sleepless carved a role for themselves, Not chosen, not celebrated perhaps, but indispensable. When the world was cold and hostile, the people who could not close their eyes kept humanity's fragile spark alive. One fire, one whispered story, one long wakeful night at a time. What if the figures we call shamans, those mysterious intermediaries between the human and the unseen, were not only chosen for their knowledge of plants or their charisma, but also for the simple fact that their minds worked differently from those around them? 30,000 years ago, in the scattered camps of Ice Age Eurasia, not everyone saw the world in the same way. Some individuals seemed to enter trance states more readily, some reported visions or heard voices in the silence, and some carried themselves with a sense of strangeness that set them apart from the rhythm of ordinary life. To their peers, this could be unsettling, but it could also be profoundly useful. Those who slipped most easily into altered states were often asked to guide the group in matters of meaning, healing, and decision-making. Across anthropological records of later hunter-gatherer and early farming societies, a pattern emerges. Shamans, healers, and ritual specialists were frequently people whose cognition diverged from the majority. They might fast alone for days, claiming visions of animals or ancestors. They might speak in unusual patterns, their voices marked as different from common speech. They might be prone to long bouts of solitude, or to sudden, unpredictable bursts of activity. In many cultures, these traits were not stigmatized but honored. The unusual was reinterpreted as sacred. If you could not sleep, perhaps it was because the spirit spoke to you. If you seemed lost in a private world, perhaps it was because you walked partly in another realm. The archaeological hints are faint but intriguing. Carvings of hybrid creatures, part human, part animal, appear in Ice Age art, such as the famous Lion Man figurine found in Germany, dating to roughly 30,000 years ago. These beings may reflect visions of transformation that shamans reported during trance states. Cave paintings sometimes include handprints that scholars suspect could have belonged to individuals who were outsiders in their communities, marked as different but also as integral. Bones of certain individuals show they were buried with objects not tied directly to hunting or domestic life, but to performance and spectacle, rattles, masks, costumes. These may have been the belongings of those whose roles were not about daily survival, but about mediating the mysteries that survival left unexplained. Ethnographic parallels add weight to this reading. In societies from Siberia to the Americas, shamans have often been described as chosen by illness, accident, or mental peculiarity. A child who behaved oddly might later be recognized as someone destined to serve as a healer. A young adult prone to visions might be initiated into ritual practice. The social contract was clear. Your strangeness was a burden, but it was also a gift. You could not hunt like others, but you could travel in imagination and bring back something the group needed, an explanation, a story, a connection with forces greater than themselves. This raises an enduring question about human variation. Was neurodivergence, if we can cautiously use that term across deep time, one of the raw materials out of which culture itself was built? The shamans remind us that divergence was not always sidelined, but often woven into the heart of community life. The extraordinary and the unsettling became tools for meaning-making. And perhaps it was in that space, where strangeness became sacred, that some of the earliest foundations of religion, myth and philosophy began to take shape. In that sense, the shamans and the strangers of the Ice Age may not have been outliers at all. They were the quiet architects of the symbolic landscapes that still shape us today. Some of the most intriguing evidence for these roles lies not only in the artefacts of Ice Age Europe, but also in the enduring echoes of oral traditions from much later societies. When anthropologists in the 20th century began documenting shamanic practices in Siberia, Mongolia, and the circumpolar north, they noticed remarkable continuity in the imagery of transformation, humans becoming birds, bears, or antlered deer during rituals. These images mirror Paleolithic carvings and paintings that suggest beings caught mid-shape, neither entirely human nor entirely animal. It is tempting to think that the people 30,000 years ago who embodied these roles were recognized for their ability to imagine, or perhaps genuinely feel, that boundary dissolving within themselves. Equally important is the communal response to such figures. For the group, the shaman was not simply an eccentric individual. They were a necessary mediator who justified their strangeness through service. They led rites to call back game animals, heal the sick, or bring comfort to the grieving. Their oddness was tolerated and supported because it was tied to survival and cohesion. Even if some members of the band remained skeptical, the social structure provided space for them to perform these tasks. In small, fragile groups, even a symbolic advantage could be enough to preserve lives. Another layer to consider is performance. The shamans did not only work through inner states but through outward displays, drumming, dancing, chanting, or donning elaborate costumes of feathers, bones, or painted skin. These performances were not mere spectacle. They were structured experiences that altered the emotions and perceptions of the entire group. In modern terms, we might see this as a form of communal therapy, but for Ice Age societies, it was inseparable from cosmology. The person who saw the world differently created experiences that reshaped how everyone else saw the world too. We must remain careful not to romanticize or project too much certainty into this picture. There is no direct way to know how individuals thought or felt 30,000 years ago. What we do know is that human societies consistently made room for those who diverged from the majority, and often those individuals became the custodians of belief and imagination. This recognition is sobering in its own way. Instead of imagining a prehistory where only the strongest hunters mattered, we see one where survival also rested on those who were, in some sense, the most unusual. The strangers were not cast out but integrated. They sat at the fire's edge, sometimes unsettling, sometimes revered, always necessary. Their presence reminds us that the spectrum of human minds is not an invention of the modern era. It is as old as our species and perhaps as old as culture itself. The shamans stand as early proof that humanity's story was never written by a single kind of mind. It was always a collaboration between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between those who followed the path and those who wandered into visions and returned with something worth keeping. What kind of mind looks at a scatter of dots in the night sky and sees a bear, a hunter, or a bird chasing a fish? What kind of mind carves small incisions into bone, not for decoration, but to keep track of something invisible to anyone else? Between 25,000 and 15,000 years ago, in the depths of Ice Age Europe, human bands were experimenting with abstraction in a way we can still trace through their artifacts. It is here that we see some of the clearest signs that individuals with an unusual obsession for patterns, cycles, and sequences had a special place within their societies. Take the carved bones and antlers found in sites from France to Siberia, etched with sequences of lines and dots. To a casual eye, they might look like scratches made absent-mindedly while sharpening a tool. But archaeologists have long debated whether these markings represent early attempts at tallying days, counting prey, or tracking lunar cycles. The Ashanga bone, found much later in Africa but echoing this same tendency, is covered in groups of notches that many scholars believe reflect a rudimentary calendar or arithmetic system. In Ice Age Europe, similar pieces suggest that some individuals were already watching the sky, noticing the phases of the moon, and connecting celestial patterns with earthly rhythms like the migrations of herds or the cycles of fertility. The capacity to do this was not universal. It required a cognitive style that could hold abstract connections in mind, linking dots on a bone with lights in the sky, or animal behaviour with lunar phases. These were not obvious links in the chaos of survival. Most people were likely content to react to immediate needs, where food was today, where shelter could be found before the storm. But some individuals seem compelled to trace beyond the immediate, to obsess over repetitions, to see invisible structures that governed the visible world. In groups that struggled constantly with scarcity, having even one person wired to perceive long-term cycles could make the difference between famine and preparedness. This same impulse appears in the caves. At sites like Lascaux and Chauvet, animals are painted in motion, layered as if capturing multiple phases of a hunt or a migration. Some researchers argue that these were not just art but attempts to freeze patterns, seasons, behaviours, the pulse of the natural world, into symbolic form. To create such images required more than skill. It required a mind tuned to repetition, to detail, to cycles that others might overlook. In a sense, the artists and the counters belong to the same tribe of thought, those compelled by structure. We might imagine that these pattern seekers were sometimes misunderstood by their companions. What use was it to count scratches on a bone when there was meat to prepare? Yet when herds returned on schedule, or when the moon's rhythm matched the rhythm of the hunt, these individuals proved their value. Their abstract obsessions were translated into survival knowledge. What seemed eccentric became indispensable. Even more striking is how these early efforts foreshadowed humanity's later achievements. The same cognitive variation that drove some Ice Age people to mark bones and map stars laid the groundwork for astronomy, mathematics, and written language. But at the time, it was simply another way of surviving, another niche role played by minds that could not ignore the patterns stitched into the chaos of Ice Age life. There is also the question of who, within these Ice Age communities, was drawn to the task of watching the sky or carving endless lines into bone. Archaeologists rarely find such etched objects scattered at random. They appear in particular places, sometimes clustered in caves that already hold evidence of symbolic activity. This suggests that they were not created by everyone equally, but by specific individuals who felt compelled to dedicate time and energy to recording what others might have ignored. In the harsh conditions of Ice Age Europe, when every calorie and every hour mattered, such dedication is striking. It tells us that certain minds must have been granted the freedom, or insisted on the freedom, to pursue an obsession with pattern making, even when its immediate usefulness may not have been obvious to others. The ability to detect recurring sequences in the environment has evolutionary roots, of course. Many animals rely on it. Birds migrate by recognizing celestial cues, predators learn the habits of prey, and primates remember the cycles of fruiting trees. But what sets humans apart, even in the Upper Paleolithic, is the drive to externalize those patterns, to capture them in material form outside of memory. To inscribe a sequence of notches on a bone is to declare that the rhythm exists independently, that it can be consulted, revisited, and shared. It shifts knowledge from something fleeting inside the mind to something enduring in the world. And to take that step required a kind of cognitive style that was probably rare. Most members of a group may have appreciated patterns when explained to them, but only a few had the inclination to pursue them obsessively and mark them down. Some researchers have suggested that these early tally marks may represent lunar calendars, tracking 29 or 30-day cycles. If so, they reveal not only an interest in the heavens, but also in linking celestial changes with earthly concerns, such as hunting or fertility. The full moon illuminates the night, making hunting easier. The phases of the moon affect tides, and may have been thought to influence animals or plants. To notice such links requires a mind that leaps between domains, connecting sky and earth, numbers and behaviour. In this sense, the pattern seekers were early scientists, though their science was embedded in survival and ritual rather than laboratories or equations. There is also the social dimension. Those who mastered pattern recognition may have become advisors or guides within their bands, not through brute strength, but through reputation for foresight. If someone consistently predicted the arrival of herds or the changing of seasons, their words would carry weight. Their peculiar obsessions were legitimized when they proved useful, and in that recognition, we see how variation in cognition was not merely tolerated, but woven into the social fabric. The dreamers who scratched marks into bone were not idle eccentrics. They were providing maps of time itself. And while we must be cautious not to overinterpret, it is difficult not to see in these artifacts the beginnings of abstraction that later blossomed into mathematics and astronomy. The Ice Age pattern seekers were not creating these fields in any modern sense, but they were carrying the seeds. Their restless attention to cycles and numbers offered their communities a glimpse of order in a chaotic world. Even if only a handful of individuals were so inclined, their contributions shaped how groups understood their place in the universe. What was invisible to most became visible through the eyes of a few, and that visibility carried the power to change how humans lived and survived. In this light, the scratches on bone and the constellations mapped in the sky are not trivial curiosities of prehistory. They are monuments to the way different minds carved space for themselves in human evolution. Some hunted, some crafted tools, some cared for the young or the wounded, and some, driven by a peculiar need to see order, counted and connected. Each role mattered, but the pattern seekers gave us a gift that reached far beyond their own lifetimes. They gave us the first glimpses of the abstract world that still defines what it means to be human. When the great experiment of agriculture began around 12,000 years ago, humanity found itself walking into an entirely new kind of landscape, one not only of crops and livestock, but of altered minds and altered roles. For nearly 2 million years, our ancestors had been wanderers, adjusting to environments by moving, by scattering, by flowing like rivers across continents. But now the seeds in the ground tethered them. Sedentism was not simply a matter of eating grain instead of meat. It was the reshaping of daily life around cycles of planting, waiting, and harvesting. For minds used to the unpredictability of the hunt, or the spontaneous opportunity of wild fruit, this new pattern could feel constraining. Yet for other minds, those inclined to obsession, patience, or meticulous planning, farming offered a vast new canvas. The tending of fields was not one task but 100 smaller ones, watching for pests, predicting rainfall, organising storage, calculating how long grain would last until the next harvest. In small bands of hunter-gatherers, variety had been a strength, but agriculture multiplied the niches further. Suddenly, there was space for the individual who never tired of monitoring grain silos, for the one who could map irrigation channels in their head, for the restless experimenter who noticed which seeds thrived in darker soils. Diversity of mind did not disappear with farming. It was rechanneled into new demands. The archaeological record shows storage pits appearing alongside the earliest farming villages. These pits were more than simple holes in the ground. They required calculations of volume, insulation, and preservation. Imagine the type of mind drawn to ensuring that none of the harvest spoiled over long months of winter. In mobile bands, survival had often depended on finding food anew. In sedentary villages, it hinged on the obsessive few who could remember details about moisture, airflow, and spoilage. Here, unusual attention to minutiae became not a quirk, but the thin line between plenty and famine. But sedentism also imposed costs. Those inclined to restless movement, to seeking new horizons, now found themselves hemmed in. For the first time in human history, fences and walls mattered more than open trails. The wanderers who once thrived on novelty-seeking may have felt stifled. Some surely left, drifting to the margins, joining groups that still lived by hunting and gathering. Others may have struggled within the rigid schedules of planting and harvesting. Agriculture created abundance, but also monotony, and monotony tests those who cannot sit still. At the same time, ritual life deepened. Farming bound people to the seasons in a way hunting never had, and with that binding came ceremonies to mark sowing, rain, and harvest. The meticulous planners who had once counted stars or animal migrations now turned their gaze to calendars and festivals. The impulse to order and control found new expression in rituals that promised to stabilize the fragile link between humans and their crops. Where one mind saw only soil and grain, another saw patterns of fertility and growth that demanded reverence and ceremony. Cognitive variation again shaped the spectrum, from the practical farmer measuring grain to the visionary who transformed agriculture into myth, and there were those who bridged the gap. In some of the earliest farming settlements, archaeologists find not only pits and tools, but symbolic carvings, figurines, and decorated vessels. These suggest that individuals existed who merged practical storage with symbolic imagination, embedding meaning into clay jars and ritualizing the act of keeping food safe. Farming was not merely about calories, it was about weaving survival into culture. Minds that once may have been outsiders in nomadic groups found new value as keepers of ritual knowledge, guardians of fertility myths, or inventors of tools to manage irrigation. The dawn of farming was, in short, a reshuffling of cognitive opportunity. It narrowed some pathways, constraining the restless roamers, and widened others, especially for those with tendencies toward patience, obsession, or abstraction. The domestication of plants and animals was also, in a sense, the domestication of certain kinds of minds. And while not all humans fit easily into this new mould, the system endured because variation was still there. Agriculture did not erase neurodiversity. It transformed the ways it was expressed, ensuring that some found new prominence, while others carried on at the edges of society, keeping alive the older instincts of movement and curiosity. In this balance we see again the humbling lesson of prehistory, that humanity has never been uniform. At every stage, the spectrum of minds was both a challenge and a strength. With farming, that spectrum became sharper, revealing how some thrived under structure and others longed for the open road. The story of agriculture is not simply about taming plants, but about how our minds themselves adapted, resisted, and redefined what it meant to survive together in one place. What is striking when we examine the archaeological traces of early farming villages is how quickly new forms of organisation emerged. Unlike the transient camps of hunter-gatherers, these sites reveal layers of rebuilding, storage bins carefully cut into the ground, and pathways carved by repeated use. To live in one place for generations required a kind of thinking that was long-term in a way nomadic life rarely demanded. The people who excelled in such settings were those who could project weeks and months into the future, anticipating shortages or planning for surplus. This does not mean that everyone in a village shared the same cognitive style. More likely, some individuals specialised in the foresight that agricultural life demanded, while others struggled or sought different roles. The unevenness of cognition, always present, now became sharper in its consequences. Archaeologists studying the earliest granaries point to evidence of deliberate pest control. Ashen herbs were sprinkled to deter insects, stones lined pits to regulate moisture. These details hint at minds with a precise eye for cause and effect, able to notice that a particular substance reduced spoilage, or that one type of soil preserved grain better than another. In a world without writing or formal measurement, such knowledge relied on obsessive memory and careful trial and error. The individuals who pursued these details may have been the overlooked members of a hunter-gatherer band, their meticulous nature once unnecessary for survival. Yet in the village their traits became vital. What had been a quirk could now feed a community. At the same time, agriculture intensified the rhythms of labour. Fields had to be ploughed and sown in synchrony. Harvests required collective effort at precise moments. For some, this synchronisation fit well. For others, it chafed. The diversity of minds meant that not everyone adapted equally well to rigid seasonal schedules. The restless innovators may have turned their energies toward tools, inventing grinding stones, sickles, or storage containers that reduced drudgery. The disciplined planners oversaw planting calendars. Those less inclined toward routine perhaps drifted to the fringes, trading with pastoralists or exploring nearby territories. Far from smoothing humanity into uniformity, agriculture sharpened the edges of difference. We can also see this in the earliest evidence of long-distance exchange. By the time farming communities were established, obsidian from distant mountains and shells from far coasts were already circulating across networks. Maintaining such connections required personalities willing to leave the settled fields, to act as intermediaries, travellers, or negotiators. In other words, even within agricultural societies, the need for variation persisted. Some were deeply rooted, others carried news, goods, and ideas from afar. Farming did not extinguish wanderlust. It simply pushed it into the service of trade and connection. Ritual life expanded alongside farming. Fertility figurines, seasonal ceremonies, and carved symbols all begin to proliferate in Neolithic sites. The reasons are practical and psychological. Farmers were dependent on rainfall, sun, and the health of crops, forces that could not be fully controlled. Ritual gave shape to this uncertainty. Those with a tendency toward visionary thinking or heightened sensitivity may have found roles as intermediaries with the unseen, leading ceremonies that bound the community together. In this way, cognitive variation once again shaped society. The obsessively practical minds preserved the harvest, the restless ones extended trade networks, and the dreamers transformed uncertainty into shared belief. What emerges from this tapestry is not a story of farming as the great equalizer, but of farming as the great divider and integrator at once. It divided humans by demanding certain cognitive styles more than others, and it integrated communities by forcing them to depend on each other's different strengths. The first villages did not thrive because everyone thought alike. They thrived because, even within the constraints of the fields, difference persisted and was harnessed in new ways. The shift to agriculture is often described as a revolution, but it was also a negotiation between land and people, between abundance and risk, and between different ways of thinking. The plough turned not just the soil, but the very terrain of the human mind. And in that churned ground, some found new purpose, while others carried the memory of a freer, wandering life. The record reminds us that there was never one way to be human, even when the field seemed to demand uniformity. 5,000 years ago, in the hot river valleys of Mesopotamia, a few individuals found themselves sitting cross-legged for hours, pressing sharp reeds into wet clay. Day after day they repeated the same gestures, carving small angled marks that, at first, represented nothing more poetic than quantities of barley or jars of oil. The question is simple but revealing. Who had the patience to do this? Not everyone could, or would, devote themselves to such meticulous repetition. Yet within the crowded villages turning into cities, there were always individuals who thrived on detail, who preferred consistency to improvisation, and who were willing to sit still while others rushed about hauling grain or herding animals. These were the first scribes, and their peculiar skill helped shape the story of civilization. Archaeologists remind us that writing did not arrive suddenly as poetry or myth, but rather as administration. Tokens, tallies, and notched bones had already served as proto-records for centuries. Around 5,000 years ago, in the cities of Uruk and Ur, these marks became standardized into cuneiform signs. To master them required extraordinary persistence. A scribe had to memorize hundreds of symbols, their meaning shifting depending on context, their arrangement changing the value of a tablet entirely. The human mind is not naturally predisposed to this kind of rigid encoding, but variation in temperament meant that some individuals possessed the focus to specialize. Where most would grow restless, they persevered. This is where cognitive diversity begins to shine in a new way. Earlier, variation allowed hunters to pursue different prey or travellers to explore distant landscapes. Now, in the setting of the first cities, those differences mapped onto social roles. The careful, detail-oriented mind became not just tolerated, but essential. Without it, contracts, inventories, and records of land ownership would vanish into the haze of memory. Oral agreements had sufficed for small groups, but cities with thousands of inhabitants demanded precision beyond recall alone. A mind that could cling to symbols as tightly as others clung to stories suddenly had immense value. We also see hints of how scribes were trained. Clay tablets show practice exercises, lists of signs repeated line after line, mistakes scratched over and corrected. These are the fingerprints of apprentices who spent their youth in disciplined environments, their talents noticed and cultivated by older masters. Perhaps these youths had already shown signs of unusual patience or fascination with patterns. Perhaps their restless peers sought other paths while they settled into the routine of training. Whatever the path, the outcome was clear: an emerging class of humans whose cognitive traits shaped their profession. And what a profession it was! Writing opened doors not just to recording, but to imagining. Once the skill of marking clay was embedded in society, new possibilities unfolded. The same careful hands that tracked sheep or grain could inscribe royal decrees, hymns, or stories. The very first literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh and its predecessors, owes its survival to the persistence of scribes who did not tire of repeating signs. Civilization's memory rested on a small subset of human minds willing to transcribe, copy, and preserve with little immediate reward. This fact reminds us of something humbling. History is not just shaped by warriors, kings, or inventors, but also by those with temperaments suited to quiet labour. The early city would have collapsed under the weight of its own complexity without individuals who could hold still long enough to scratch symbols into clay, caring about accuracy more than glory. Their lives were probably not glamorous, yet they provided the spine of record-keeping that allowed trade, law, and culture to persist. We should not romanticize this too much. Being a scribe was hard, repetitive, and bound by the authority of temples or palaces, but within that monotony, there is evidence of human diversity at work. Not everyone could or wanted to do it. A few did. And because of them, we can still read the voices of people who lived 5,000 years ago. The clay tablets survived because of accident, fires that hardened them, burying sands that preserved them. But behind their survival lies something more profound. a recognition that difference within a species is not a flaw but a foundation. It was not the uniformity of minds that built cities, but their variety, some drawn to adventure, some to craft, and some to the patient labour of signs on clay. Without the latter, the earliest cities might have been forgotten before they even had a chance to exist. If we lean closer to these tablets, another layer of the story comes into view. Writing did not just demand patience, it demanded a certain willingness to live partly in abstraction. When a scribe carved a wedge-shaped mark for barley, he was not looking at barley itself. He was holding in mind the concept of barley, detached from the grain in the granary or the stalk in the field. That leap between reality and representation may have come more easily to some minds than others, where one person needed to see, touch, and smell the harvest, another could picture rows of symbols that stood for it. This capacity for thinking in symbols may not have been universal, but for those who had it, the world unfolded differently. Scribes also remind us that early societies were not only powered by brute force or physical skill. They were held together by invisible systems of trust and accountability. A temple official might claim 10 jars of oil, but only the neat rows of wedges pressed into clay confirmed it. Here, minds adept at detail became arbiters of fairness, power, and memory. We often think of bureaucracy as tedious, but at its root was a radical human invention: impartial record. In a sense, scribes embodied the first attempt to step beyond the fragility of oral agreements. What is striking is how fragile this system remained. Many tablets from the earliest periods record mundane transactions, yet those seemingly dull notes laid the groundwork for later leaps in thought. A young scribe trained to keep grain tallies might one day be tasked with recording myths. A routine sharpened by numbers could turn, almost seamlessly, into narrative. That is how we ended up with entire libraries of stories. The clay's permanence was matched only by the scribe's persistence. If patience and abstraction were key traits, then perhaps the role of the scribe reveals something deeper about human variation. In groups of thousands, just as in small bands of foragers, there were people whose minds drifted toward different rhythms. Some needed constant movement, others could bear stillness. Some sought novelty, others thrived on repetition. In the urban sprawl of Mesopotamia, it was the still ones, the patient ones, the detail-focused ones, who became keepers of the city's mind. Without them, every deal and promise would evaporate like smoke over the rivers. When we look at those wedge marks today, often in museums under glass, we are really seeing the fingerprints of cognitive variety itself. Writing was not inevitable. It did not emerge from a collective uniformity of thought, but because some individuals were willing, or even compelled, to hold still, to track every detail, and to live part of their lives in abstraction. That is a reminder worth carrying. Sometimes the endurance of civilization rests not on those who shout the loudest, but on those who quietly insist that every mark counts, every symbol matters, and every thought deserves its place on clay. If we lean closer to these tablets, another layer of the story comes into view. Writing did not just demand patience, it demanded a certain willingness to live partly in abstraction. When a scribe carved a wedge-shaped mark for barley, he was not looking at barley itself. He was holding in mind the concept of barley, detached from the grain in the granary or the stalk in the field. That leap between reality and representation may have come more easily to some minds than others, where one person needed to see, touch, and smell the harvest, another could picture rows of symbols that stood for it. This capacity for thinking in symbols may not have been universal, but for those who had it, the world unfolded differently. Scribes also remind us that early societies were not only powered by brute force or physical skill. They were held together by invisible systems of trust and accountability. A temple official might claim 10 jars of oil, but only the neat rows of wedges pressed into clay confirmed it. Here, minds adept at detail became arbiters of fairness, power, and memory. We often think of bureaucracy as tedious, but at its root was a radical human invention: impartial record. In a sense, scribes embodied the first attempt to step beyond the fragility of oral agreements. What is striking is how fragile this system remained. Many tablets from the earliest periods record mundane transactions, Yet those seemingly dull notes laid the groundwork for later leaps in thought. A young scribe trained to keep grain tallies might one day be tasked with recording myths. A routine sharpened by numbers could turn, almost seamlessly, into narrative. That is how we ended up with entire libraries of stories. The clay's permanence was matched only by the scribe's persistence. If patience and abstraction were key traits, then perhaps the role of the scribe reveals something deeper about human variation. In groups of thousands, just as in small bands of foragers, there were people whose minds drifted toward different rhythms. Some needed constant movement, others could bear stillness. Some sought novelty, others thrived on repetition. In the urban sprawl of Mesopotamia, it was the still ones, the patient ones, the detail-focused ones, who became keepers of the city's mind. Without them, every deal and promise would evaporate like smoke over the rivers. When we look at those wedge marks today, often in museums under glass, we are really seeing the fingerprints of cognitive variety itself. Writing was not inevitable. It did not emerge from a collective uniformity of thought, but because some individuals were willing, or even compelled, to hold still, to track every detail, and to live part of their lives in abstraction. That is a reminder worth carrying. Sometimes the endurance of civilization rests not on those who shout the loudest, but on those who quietly insist that every mark counts, every symbol matters, and every thought deserves its place on clay. Imagine standing in a crowded marketplace of an ancient city 3,000 years ago. Traders are calling out their goods, the smell of spices hangs in the air, and somewhere at the edge of the square a lone figure begins to speak. At first, people ignore him. His voice is too intense, his words too rapid. But soon, the crowd falls silent, pulled by the rhythm of his speech. His eyes are wide, his gestures unrelenting, his insistence absolute. He repeats the same warnings over and over until the crowd feels them sink into their bones. Some dismiss him as mad. Others whisper that he is touched by the divine, and slowly, whether by fear, fascination, or conviction, he becomes the voice everyone remembers. The role of prophets in the ancient world often centered not on subtlety but on intensity. Their speech was excessive, ecstatic, sometimes incoherent. They shouted warnings no one wanted to hear, described visions that seemed impossible, and lived in states of fixation that others could neither understand nor imitate. From Mesopotamia to Israel, from Greece to the deserts of Arabia, ancient texts describe figures who could not stop proclaiming their visions. In a world without microphones or printing presses, their sheer persistence made them unforgettable. What is striking is how often these individuals were described as being apart from ordinary society. They were the ones who wandered alone, who fasted until weak, who lived in caves or refused to wear normal clothes. Their divergence was not hidden. It was the very foundation of their authority. For a small village or an emerging kingdom, a prophet's restless words and unsettling behaviours served a purpose. They provided warnings of danger, moral direction, or at least an outlet for communal anxiety. Ecstatic states, visions, and relentless speech have parallels across cultures. In Greece, oracles entered trances and spoke in riddles that required interpretation. In Mesopotamia, prophetic figures warned kings about battles or famines with a level of urgency that defied dismissal. In the Hebrew tradition, prophets hurled their words against corruption and injustice, refusing to stop even when imprisoned or threatened. In every case, these voices were not simply tolerated, they became necessary. There is reason to think that societies benefited from such relentless speakers. Where most people moderated themselves, prophets amplified what was unsaid. Where most people forgot, prophets repeated until memory stuck. Where most people avoided conflict, prophets insisted on it. This stubborn cognitive style could fracture communities, but it could also redirect them, offering alternative perspectives that might otherwise be silenced. In environments of uncertainty, famine, war, drought, a prophet's urgent insistence that change was needed could sometimes make the difference between adaptation and collapse. Of course, not every voice was accepted. Many prophets were ridiculed or killed, but even then their words lingered. The very extremity of their speech became part of collective memory. Some of the world's oldest surviving texts are not those of rulers or generals, but of prophets who would not stop speaking, even when no one wanted to listen. When we look back at these figures through the lens of human variation, we might see not just divine messengers, but individuals whose minds worked at a different frequency. Their relentless energy, obsessive repetition, and overwhelming visions placed them outside the ordinary, and yet it was precisely this difference that allowed them to leave such lasting marks on history. Perhaps what societies once labelled as madness or divine inspiration were, in fact, reflections of the deep diversity that has always run through human cognition, and without them, we might not have the stories, laws, or myths that have endured for thousands of years. The persistence of prophetic voices in antiquity also reveals something important about how societies handled difference. For most people, daily life demanded silence, obedience, and predictability. Farmers had to rise with the sun, tend their crops, and repeat the same tasks season after season. Craftsmen had to replicate their techniques with precision to produce useful tools, pottery, or textiles. Soldiers had to march in step, follow commands, and suppress hesitation. In this sea of conformity, the prophet stood out like a blazing torch in the night. He or she could not be contained by the expectations of labour or hierarchy, and instead of being extinguished, these voices were sometimes given space, feared, ridiculed, and yet, strangely, valued. What if the line between genius and madness has always been thinner than we like to admit? In the world of classical Greece and Rome, eccentricity was not just tolerated but sometimes elevated into a sign of divine inspiration. At the same time, those same societies feared the instability that often accompanied such brilliance. The paradox is that some of the figures most admired for their contributions to philosophy, mathematics, and art were also described in their own time as erratic, obsessive, or socially alien. This tension is a window into how ancient societies grappled with the reality that not all minds think or behave alike, and that difference can be both productive and unsettling. Consider Socrates, remembered as the father of Western philosophy. His contemporaries described him as stubborn, barefoot in all seasons, absent-minded, and prone to trances in which he stood immobile for hours. Some saw this as proof that he was touched by a divine spirit, his daimonion, whispering guidance that others could not hear. To his critics, however, it was eccentricity bordering on madness. His death sentence in Athens was framed not just as punishment for his teachings, but as a defence of the city against a disruptive, strange figure whose difference threatened convention. Here, strangeness was both the spark of philosophical revolution and the reason for persecution. The mathematician Pythagoras presents another example. His obsession with numbers, harmony, and cosmic order became the foundation of a mystical movement that blurred science with spirituality. His followers lived by rigid rules, including dietary restrictions and rituals that made them seem like a cult. Pythagoras himself was described as obsessive, with a fixation on patterns that would later be recognized as revolutionary insights into mathematics and music theory. Yet his school ended in violence, with accusations of secrecy, elitism, and dangerous fanaticism. Once again, difference produced brilliance, but also suspicion. The Roman world had its own ambivalence. On one hand, figures like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius admired the philosophical eccentric who withdrew from society, cultivating a mind untethered from everyday distractions. On the other, the Romans valued order, discipline, and predictability, seeing uncontrolled eccentricity as a threat to civic stability. Artists and poets such as Ovid might be admired for their imaginative power, yet when their vision became too disruptive to imperial authority, they were exiled. Madness and genius walked hand in hand, but society drew harsh lines when difference became too destabilizing. The Greeks even institutionalized this duality in their language. The word mania could mean madness, but it could also mean a form of divine possession, a frenzy that brought access to higher truths. Plato argued that some of the greatest gifts to humanity, poetry, prophecy, love, and art, came from this kind of inspired madness. To him, the eccentric mind was not broken, but open to forces beyond normal human reason. Yet others in Athens mocked the same behaviours as signs of instability and unreliability. The result was a culture that alternated between reverence and ridicule, often depending on whether the eccentric's output was seen as useful. This duality shaped not only how individuals were treated, but how whole societies thought about knowledge. The image of the lone philosopher or inventor, isolated from the crowd, was romanticized in part because it was abnormal. The very traits that set someone apart from their peers — obsession, compulsive attention to detail, disregard for social convention — became associated with extraordinary insight. But the risk was always present, that the same differences might tip into self-destruction or lead followers astray. Ancient writers frequently told stories of philosophers starving themselves, artists driven to despair, or mathematicians ridiculed as impractical dreamers. What this reveals is that the Greeks and Romans lived with the awareness that human minds are not uniform, and that diversity in cognition is both a gift and a danger. They did not have the language of modern psychology, but they recognized patterns. They saw that some people noticed what others overlooked, that some fixated on abstractions while others focused on practical tasks, that some were restless and disruptive while others were steady and cautious. They built myths, philosophies, and cautionary tales around these differences, using them to explain both the triumphs and tragedies of human thought. And so we inherit from them a question that still lingers today. Were these eccentric geniuses simply anomalies, lucky accidents whose obsessions happened to benefit culture? Or were they part of a deeper, necessary variation, one that ensured human societies had at any given moment someone willing to stand outside the norm and imagine the impossible? Even the way ancient societies staged their public life reflected this paradox of revering and fearing eccentricity. Greek theatre, for instance, often dramatized characters who straddled the border between madness and insight. Tragic heroes like Ajax or Orestes were depicted as seized by fits of frenzy, their actions destructive but also strangely revelatory of deeper truths about human fate. In comedy, the oddball character, the fool, the drunkard, the obsessive schemer, became a source of laughter but also of recognition. The audience knew such personalities existed in real life, on the margins of the agora, in households, and even among the aristocracy. By putting them on stage, society was both acknowledging and controlling their presence, turning eccentricity into spectacle while signalling its risks. Philosophical schools themselves sometimes cultivated eccentricity as a badge of authenticity. The Cynics, for example, deliberately rejected social norms, wandering the streets barefoot, living with minimal possessions, and challenging passers-by with uncomfortable truths. Diogenes of Sinope, perhaps the most famous cynic, was remembered for living in a barrel and mocking Alexander the Great. To admirers, his shamelessness proved his philosophical purity, a refusal to conform to the hypocrisies of polite society. To critics, it was madness disguised as wisdom. In Diogenes, we see how eccentric behaviour could be reframed as a conscious philosophy, even as it tested the patience of more conventional citizens. The Romans, too, recognized that unusual temperaments sometimes produced extraordinary skill. They admired engineers and architects whose obsessive precision allowed for aqueducts, roads, and monumental temples that still stand today. Yet Roman writers also warned about the dangers of furor, the unrestrained passion that could unhinge reason. Julius Caesar's epileptic seizures, for example, became woven into speculation about his personality and ambition, with some contemporaries suggesting that his brilliance in politics was inseparable from his volatility. Even emperors were not free from the stigma and fascination of difference. When Caligula or Nero displayed bizarre behaviour, it was described alternately as divine eccentricity or pathological madness, depending on who told the story. The same society that celebrated genius feared what happened when that genius lost its balance. We might also consider how eccentricity shaped the visual arts. Sculptors and painters in antiquity were often described as obsessive, repeating forms endlessly in pursuit of ideal beauty. Some, like the architect Phidias, became legends for their ability to channel obsession into works of grandeur, while others fell into obscurity or scandal. The stereotype of the artist as unstable genius was already forming in these centuries before Renaissance biographies of mad painters like Caravaggio made it iconic. For the ancients, the link between unusual minds and extraordinary works was both inspiring and troubling. a reminder that innovation did not come without costs. In the end, what ties these examples together is the constant balancing act. Societies needed their eccentrics to push boundaries, to imagine new forms of knowledge, to embody the unpredictable spark of inspiration. But they also feared that the same qualities could undermine order, challenge authority, or destabilize communities. The legacy of Greece and Rome is not a single judgment about eccentric minds, but a record of their ambivalence, a recognition that human diversity, while sometimes unsettling, has always been part of the engine of cultural progress. By the time Europe entered the long centuries we now call the medieval period, the tolerance that earlier cultures sometimes held for eccentricity began to narrow. The small village, the monastery, and the feudal town could be protective environments, but they could also be suspicious ones. Where Greece had once laughed at the antics of cynics, or Rome had marvelled at the strange habits of philosophers, medieval Europe often cast such divergence in the darker light of sin, possession, or witchcraft. The question was no longer whether unusual minds contributed something useful, but whether they threatened the moral and spiritual order. One of the clearest examples of this shift is the rise of witch persecutions. Across rural landscapes, behaviours that set individuals apart, solitary lifestyles, unusual speech patterns, knowledge of herbs, or sudden outbursts of visions, could be recast as evidence of a pact with the devil. It was not necessarily that the individual was more different than her ancestors, but that the framework of explanation had shifted. Christianity offered both salvation and suspicion, and within its cosmology, difference often needed to be explained through the battle between good and evil. An elderly woman with deep knowledge of plants could be revered as a healer one year, and accused as a witch the next, depending on whether crops flourished or failed. But divergence was not always condemned. In monasteries and among mystics, unusual mental states were sometimes interpreted as holy. The figure of the holy fool appeared in both Eastern Orthodox and Western traditions. Individuals who rejected normal society, behaved erratically, or lived in voluntary poverty, and who were nevertheless thought to be touched by divine truth. They might wander unclothed, speak in riddles, or act out strange performances, and instead of being executed, they were tolerated, even venerated. What mattered was whether the community believed their oddness carried divine meaning or demonic danger. The same eccentric act could be sanctified in one context and punished in another. Medieval chronicles also reveal how madness itself was perceived. In towns and cities, the insane could be simultaneously pitied and feared. Some were kept on the fringes, wandering freely, while others were confined. The line between madman, possessed, and prophet was rarely clear. Pilgrimages to shrines often included the hope of healing not only physical illness but also mental disturbance, suggesting that difference was not only stigmatized but also woven into the religious economy of hope, miracle, and suffering. Court culture, meanwhile, developed its own outlet for divergence in the figure of the fool or jester. Unlike the holy fool who existed outside institutions, the court fool was licensed to act strangely within them. They could mock kings, parody rituals, and say what others dared not, all under the cover of humour. Their eccentricity was not hidden, but institutionalized, demonstrating both the need to control difference and the recognition that it had a function. A well-placed joke or absurdity could diffuse tension at court, or highlight truths no counsellor dared state directly. Thus, medieval Europe presented a spectrum of responses to divergence, from burning at the stake to sainthood, from chains in a dungeon to laughter in the king's hall. The common thread was that difference was rarely seen as neutral. It demanded interpretation, and the interpretation carried consequences. These centuries remind us that how societies treat cognitive and behavioural diversity is not fixed, but depends on larger frameworks of belief, fear, and power. The same restless voice that might once have been honoured as a prophet could, under a different cosmology, be silenced as a witch. Beyond the village square and the monastery, divergence in the medieval world was also shaped by law and custom. Local courts often treated the behaviour of outcasts with suspicion, and records show how even petty differences could be amplified into accusations. A person who spoke too quickly, laughed inappropriately, or seemed unable to follow the rhythms of daily life might be branded a misfit, and misfits were easy scapegoats. When unexplained tragedies struck, the death of livestock, the collapse of a roof, or the spread of disease, those on the margins bore the heaviest burden of blame. This mechanism of suspicion reveals a broader truth. Divergence was rarely seen in isolation, but always against the backdrop of collective anxiety. The medieval city introduced yet another layer. Urban centres were hubs of trade and ideas, but also of regulation. Guilds, which controlled professions, required conformity to rules and hierarchies. Those who struggled to meet exacting standards of behaviour or craft were often excluded. Yet even here, we find contradictions. Some of the most idiosyncratic personalities, such as visionaries or scribes who worked outside guild systems, still left a legacy in illuminated manuscripts and mystical writings. The very people dismissed as eccentric in one sphere could flourish in another if they found a pocket of tolerance or a patron willing to shield them. Pilgrimage culture also created strange spaces for divergent individuals. Pilgrims' routes across Europe were populated not only by pious travellers, but also by those who lived on the edges of society, some of whom turned their difference into a livelihood. Accounts described figures who claimed visions, offered blessings, or sold charms along the way. While some were denounced as frauds, others were embraced as part of the unpredictable spiritual landscape of the journey. The blurred lines between sanctity, trickery, and madness gave divergent minds a liminal but enduring presence in medieval religious life. We should also remember that the medieval period was not static. Responses to divergence shifted over centuries. Early medieval communities often tolerated a broader range of behaviour, interpreting it within local folklore rather than systematic persecution. By the later Middle Ages, with the growth of centralised church authority and rising fears of heresy, tolerance narrowed. Accusations of witchcraft intensified, and inquisitions created new pressures to conform. Yet even as repression grew, alternative traditions of reverence survived. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, whose visionary experiences might easily have been condemned, instead found audiences who preserved her work as divinely inspired. The medieval approach to unusual minds was therefore not one of simple hostility. It was fragmented, contradictory, and deeply entangled with the needs and fears of the time. Divergence could be condemned as dangerous, embraced as holy, or laughed at as entertaining, and often the same traits moved between these categories depending on who was watching. In these shifting responses, we see the enduring tension between the social need for conformity and the undeniable persistence of human difference. In the centuries between the 16th and 18th, Europe entered a period historians call the Scientific Revolution. It is often described as a time of rationality, experiment, and method, when observation replaced superstition and measurement displaced faith. But if we look closer at the lives of the figures who made this revolution possible, we find that it was not only calm reason that built modern science, but also the obsessive, restless, and sometimes forgetful qualities of unusual minds. These traits, often difficult in daily life, became engines of discovery when focused on questions of the natural world. Take Johannes Kepler, the German astronomer whose calculations laid the groundwork for modern celestial mechanics. He spent endless hours tracing the orbits of planets, driven by a compulsion to reconcile data that did not fit earlier models. His correspondence shows a man consumed by detail, unable to let go of tiny discrepancies. Kepler revised and recalculated tirelessly, convinced that the universe had a hidden mathematical order. Many contemporaries dismissed his stubbornness as madness, but it was precisely this refusal to leave problems unsolved that allowed him to discover the elliptical nature of planetary orbits. His mind could not rest, and the modern understanding of the solar system emerged from that restlessness. Isaac Newton, another giant of this era, embodied similar traits. Accounts from his peers describe him as capable of working without pause for days, forgetting to eat or sleep, his attention so tightly locked on mathematical problems that he could appear absent from the world around him. Newton was not only a physicist, but also an alchemist and theologian, filling pages with speculations that his later admirers often tried to downplay. Yet, it was his obsessive focus, his willingness to pursue a single line of reasoning to its absolute conclusion, that gave us the laws of motion and gravity. Some contemporaries saw him as reclusive and difficult, but his unusual mental style became central to the revolution in natural philosophy. Beyond these famous figures, the scientific revolution depended on thousands of less remembered cataloguers, collectors, and measurers. Natural historians filled cabinets with insects, shells, and plants, carefully labelling and describing each specimen. Their passion for order and categorization may have looked eccentric to neighbours, but it created the first encyclopedic attempts to map the diversity of life. Astronomers kept night watches, marking every position of the stars with painstaking accuracy, even when clouds and fatigue made the task miserable. Mathematicians filled notebooks with endless series and proofs, often with no immediate application, yet laying the groundwork for the sciences that followed. What unites these figures is not conformity to a model of balanced reason, but a spectrum of unusual cognitive tendencies. The obsessive, the single-minded, the forgetful, and the socially withdrawn all found niches within this new intellectual landscape. Their differences, once seen as peculiarities, became the foundations of scientific progress. In their time, these individuals were not always easy companions, yet in hindsight, their very divergence from ordinary patterns of thought appears essential. It reminds us that human knowledge has often advanced not in spite of our differences, but because of them. One of the striking features of this period is how the broader society sometimes struggled to make sense of such figures. Kepler's intense focus, Newton's seclusion, or Tycho Brahe's eccentric astronomical pursuits could easily be interpreted as signs of instability, or even folly by contemporaries who prized balance and social decorum. Yet their obsessions aligned with a cultural moment in which data, measurement, and record-keeping were beginning to acquire unprecedented value. The very qualities that made them awkward neighbours or distant colleagues also made them indispensable pioneers of a new intellectual order. The culture of obsessive note-taking that blossomed in these centuries offers another window into the link between divergent minds and discovery. Scholars like Robert Hooke and Antony van Leeuwenhoek filled endless journals with minute descriptions, sometimes of things few others cared to notice. Hooke sketched fleas and plant cells under his microscope with extraordinary attention, producing illustrations that revealed hidden worlds. Van Leeuwenhoek spent decades refining lenses, peering at pond water and saliva, and writing hundreds of letters about what he saw. To some, this might have seemed an unproductive fixation, but it opened the microbial world to human awareness for the first time. Their persistence was not a quirk on the margins of science. It was science itself in its formative stage. At the same time, there were those whose unusual traits veered toward forgetfulness or disorganization rather than obsessive precision. Accounts exist of brilliant natural philosophers who misplaced their manuscripts, lost track of experiments, or relied on assistants to keep their work in order. Far from disqualifying them, these quirks sometimes forced collaboration, spreading responsibility across teams of scholars, apprentices, and correspondents. In this way, the diversity of cognitive styles, some intensely systematic, others erratic but inspired, created a balance within the emerging scientific community. It was a messy process, but one that ensured that different kinds of thinkers all contributed. Importantly, the scientific revolution was not only about individuals, but about networks. Letters crossed Europe in vast correspondence chains, with eccentric thinkers sharing discoveries, puzzles, and arguments. Some were verbose to the point of overwhelming their readers, others wrote cryptically or sparsely, but together they built a web of communication that allowed knowledge to accumulate. It is telling that some of these networks prized individuals who could not stop asking questions, who filled pages with details others might discard. Diversity of temperament and cognitive style was not just tolerated but harnessed, woven into the collective advance of knowledge. In retrospect, the age of Kepler, Newton, and their contemporaries illustrates how the traits we sometimes label as too much, or too little, in ordinary life, too obsessive, too distracted, too restless, too withdrawn, have in the right context opened new chapters of human understanding. The scientific revolution was not powered solely by reason's calm flame, but also by the restless sparks of unusual minds, whose very differences made them indispensable. The 19th century brought a transformation in human life so rapid and disorienting that it left almost no part of daily existence untouched. The slow rhythms of farming and village life, which had structured human societies for thousands of years, gave way to the strict pulses of factory bells, military drills, and standardized schools. For the first time in history, millions of people were asked to conform not only in belief but in bodily rhythm, to wake at the same hour, work at the same pace, march in step, and absorb information in lockstep with peers. Within this new world of iron, smoke, and uniformity, minds that strayed from the prescribed path became more visible and often more stigmatized. In earlier ages, eccentricity had sometimes found niches of survival. The mystic tolerated in a monastery, the odd healer in a village, the relentless calculator within a circle of natural philosophers. But in the 19th century, industrial societies became increasingly intolerant of deviation. The factory required precision timing and repetitive motions. The school imposed identical lessons on every child, punishing those who could not sit still, memorize on command, or recite correctly. Armies, expanding with nationalism and empire, demanded absolute obedience, stamping out improvisation in favour of drill. To falter in such environments was no longer simply to be unusual, it was to be marked as defective. At the same time, the rise of psychiatry began to formalise this new intolerance. Physicians in Europe started to classify what they called mental illnesses with unprecedented zeal. Terms like hysteria, neurasthenia, and idiocy emerged, not as neutral descriptors, but as categories of deviance that helped define the boundaries of normality. The asylum became both a refuge and a prison. For some, it offered shelter from a society that could not accommodate them. For others, it was a place of indefinite confinement. Records from these institutions show patients with traits we might now recognise as extreme focus, compulsive behaviours, or difficulties with social conformity. But in the language of the time, such differences were cast not as variations but as pathologies. Industrial capitalism amplified this process by linking worth to productivity. To work a machine without pause, to produce uniform goods at uniform speeds, became the measure of human value. Those who could not keep up were not only poor but also labelled unfit, a double stigma that reinforced the emerging medical categories. In this sense, the machine age did not invent neurodivergence, but it recast it, turning once neutral or even useful variations into disorders under the pressure of mass conformity. Yet even in this rigid environment, difference found ways to persist. Some eccentric minds fueled the very engines of industrial innovation. Inventors like Nikola Tesla displayed obsessive creativity, often paired with behaviours that baffled those around them. While institutions pathologized deviation, individuals like Tesla transformed it into breakthroughs in electricity and engineering. This duality, condemnation of divergence on one hand, exploitation of it for progress on the other, defined the 19th century's uneasy relationship with unusual minds. By the century's end, the stage was set for a modern paradox that remains with us. Societies that demand conformity, while depending on those who think and act differently to create the very innovations that make conformity possible. The machine age had revealed not only the price of divergence, but also its hidden power, even as psychiatry and industrial order sought to cage it. The 19th century also saw the emergence of public discourse that tied mental difference directly to social danger. With the rapid expansion of cities, anxieties about crime, poverty, and disorder often became projected onto those who behaved differently. Medical journals, newspapers, and even popular novels reinforced the image of the madman in the street or the unruly child as threats to the progress of industrial society. Behind such portrayals lay a deeper fear that the rigid order of factories, schools, and parliaments could be undone by the unpredictability of the human mind. The more society demanded conformity, the more it feared those who seemed unable or unwilling to provide it. The asylum system grew in response to this fear. In Britain, France, and Germany, enormous institutions were built to house thousands, often justified as humane alternatives to neglect. Yet life inside them was rarely humane. Uniform clothing, rigid schedules, and silence enforced discipline, echoing the rhythms of the factories outside. The asylum, in effect, was the factory turned inward, an institution designed not to accommodate difference but to suppress it. Still, not every physician agreed with this model. Reformers like Philippe Pinel and Dorothea Dix argued that patients needed compassion and stimulation, not chains and punishment. Their efforts introduced more therapeutic approaches, though the basic assumption that difference was pathology remained intact. Meanwhile, the sciences of measurement were sharpening their tools. The invention of statistical methods and the rise of fields like phrenology reflected an obsession with quantifying human variation. Although phrenology would later be dismissed as pseudoscience, its popularity shows how eager people were to reduce mental complexity into visible categories. Charts of skull shapes, reaction times, or attention spans offered the illusion of control over diversity. What could not be measured in factories or schools could be measured, at least in theory, in minds. In the process, individuality was recast as data, and divergence became a deviation from the norm curve. Yet even as psychiatry and statistics framed divergence as deficiency, some intellectuals resisted. Romantic poets like William Blake or Lord Byron embraced madness as a form of higher vision, a counterpoint to the dull rationality of industrial life. Artists and writers began to reclaim eccentricity as a source of creativity, deliberately standing against the grinding uniformity of the age. This resistance did not erase stigma, but it kept alive the idea that difference was not merely disorder, that the human mind could not be flattened into identical units. By the close of the 19th century, Europe and America had entered a new phase of contradiction. On the one hand, industrial systems, military drills, and schools insisted on standardization more than ever before. On the other, the seeds of modern psychology, art and literature were beginning to insist that divergence mattered. The age of machines had tried to iron out human variation, but it could not succeed entirely. In the cracks of conformity, difference still flickered, reminding societies that even in an era of gears and schedules, the human mind could never be made truly uniform. The story we have been following does not end with the past, though it is rooted in it. It folds back on itself, like a spiral, reminding us that the great experiment of our species has always been conducted not only with bones and tools, but with minds. When we look across the timeline, from Australopiths navigating mixed habitats 3 million years ago, to early humans scattering into Asia and Europe, to the Ice Age hunters scanning the heavens for patterns invisible to others, what stands out is not uniformity, but a stubborn, useful difference. Not every hominin thought alike, not every individual processed the world in the same way. And in that simple, often overlooked truth lies one of the quiet forces that has kept Homo sapiens not just alive but adaptive. The temptation in every era has been to narrow the definition of the normal mind, to believe that one shape of thought should guide the whole. Yet prehistory tells us otherwise. The foragers who noticed plants no one else would taste, the navigators who remembered riverside paths, the storytellers who could hold details for decades, the restless wanderers who refused to stay still. These were not defects in the human pattern, they were the pattern. Groups that contained only one kind of thinker were brittle. Groups that carried within them a range of tendencies, cautious and reckless, focused and drifting, silent and talkative, had options when landscapes shifted, when climates hardened, when food disappeared. The Ice Age bands who huddled around fire could not have known it, but they were rehearsing a principle we can state only now. Variability itself is survival. A species of many minds can bend where others break. That is why we outlasted not only rival hominins, but also the countless extinctions that stalked the Pleistocene. Not through perfection, but through unevenness. Looking back from the present, it is humbling to realize that the very traits we often try to suppress, medicalize, or pathologize may have once been the margins of advantage. The sleepless, the obsessive, the divergent, the dreamers, these were not errors in the system. They were the system, one that allowed our ancestors to invent, to endure, to imagine. Today we live in an age that tries again to compress thought into metrics, to flatten complexity into categories. But the long record of our species argues for something else. It argues that no single mind ever defined humanity. The strength of Homo sapiens is that there was never only one kind of Homo sapiens. And so, as we close this story, the question is no longer whether different minds belong. The evidence of deep time shows they always have. The real question is whether we will remember that truth and allow the diversity of thought that carried us through ice, fire, and famine to carry us through the challenges still to come. Because in the end, resilience was never a tool, or a fire, or a weapon. It was the persistence of difference, the species of many minds. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.